Good afternoon to everyone who is joining us via live stream and also to all of you who are joining us here in person. My name is Maria McWhirter, and I am the project director for the Connecting Communities Digital Initiative, aka CCDI. My colleagues, Olivia Dorsey, Brian Fu, Kimber Thomas, and I are so happy that you've joined us for CCDI's second annual Summer Fuse event. CCDI is part of the Libraries of the People, Widening the Path, multi-year initiative funded by the Mellon Foundation. CCDI and Of the People are committed to individuals and groups of color and the research and study of groups of color and amplifying them at the library. Our theme this year is celebrating the nexus. A nexus is defined as a connection or series of connections linking two or more things, and is also defined as a central place. Over the past 2.5 years, CCDI has connected advisory board members, awardees, interns, and invited artists, research, and scholars. And we do so with the Library of Congress as the place in which we can critique, create, imagine, and produce. And today we are giving you a glimpse of the amazing people and projects that CCDI has been able to bring together and support. First, we will begin with our 5 new awardees sharing their projects. Second, Maya Cade, CCDI's, and the library scholar in residence will be in conversation with Andre Bach, a CCDI advisory board member, about her project, Tenderness in Black Film. And then third, we will have a panel discussion on Asian American and Pacific Islander digital humanities, moderated by Jeffrey U. Warren, the library's innovator in residence. After each session, we will have Q&A. So those of you attending virtually, you can feel free to place your questions in the Q&A feature at any time throughout the sessions. And my colleague Sahar will field those questions for our in-person attendees. And we will also, for those of you here in person, we'll have 2 microphones near the stage, and we'll bring those mics to you so that you can ask your questions. At this time, Roswell Encina, the library's Chief Communications Officer, will come to the stage to offer a welcome. Roswell will then introduce Natalie Buddha-Smith, who will introduce the new awardees. Roswell, come on up, please.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to everyone here at the Thomas Jefferson Building, and welcome to everybody who's watching online. As Maria mentioned, I'm Roswell Encina. I'm the Chief Communications Officer for the Library of Congress, and on behalf of the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, she welcomes and appreciates everyone's work here today. I am excited to tell everyone that we are very proud of the Connecting Communities Digital Initiative here at the Library of Congress, because it continues to provide financial and technical support to awardees as they produce imaginative projects using the library's digital collections. I think since Dr. Hayden became librarian, our big mission, of course, is try to connect and engage Americans from coast to coast. Whether you're in California or South Carolina, or from Texas to South Dakota, we want to make sure that everybody knows that the Library of Congress is for them, and CCDI is making sure this happens. As the main digital component of the Libraries of the People, Widening the Path multi-year initiative funded by the Mellon Foundation, it has encouraged greater use of the library's digital collections, highlighted the wealth of materials by and about communities of color, and exposed how user research is essential to the library's goals of improving its collections and services. It's been very important to us to make sure that we collect, but most importantly, preserve stories of Americans and communities that have historically been neglected, or their stories have never been told, whether it's Chinese Americans in the forgotten part of Providence, Rhode Island, or Japanese Americans who live in Japantown in Los Angeles, or African Americans who live in Houston, Texas, or even Filipino Americans who live just down the street in Falls Church, Virginia. As part of the Library's Congress mission, we want to make sure that we hear these stories, but most importantly, collect them so future generations know that there's a part of American history that's our collective history as well. So, I know you're here to hear from our panelists, so it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Natalie Buddha-Smith, who is the library's new Director of Digital Strategy. In that role, Natalie guides the library on digital enablement through research, methods, best practices, and technology. Please join me in welcoming my wonderful colleague, Natalie.
Thank you, Roswell. Good afternoon, and thank you again to everyone who's joining us virtually and here in person. I'm Natalie Buda-Smith, Director of Digital Strategy at the library. I also want to thank the CCDI team. They're doing a tremendous job. Maria, Olivia, Brian, Kimber, and everyone else who's helping us. Thank you so much. It takes a lot of effort to put on something like this, and it's a wonderful event, and the team is doing a fantastic job. It's also been a privilege for me to see CCDI and the grantees, and to also be a part of the library's digital transformation over the last few years. We are currently wrapping up our next strategic plan with the digital baked in and communities throughout our goals and objectives. CCDI is part of the library's broader Of the People Widening the Path program funded by the Mellon Foundation. It's also a very organic, and I'm going to use the word nexus, to our mission, vision, and goals for a more community-centric and digitally enabled library. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce the newest CCDI award recipients who will tell us more about the work they're doing to make that vision a reality. There are a total of 5 recipients. 2 are higher education awardees, and 3 are libraries, archives, museums awardees. The first one is Boone County Public Library of Kentucky. Their project, African Americans of the Kentucky Borderlands, utilizing Library of Congress collections, will expand its African Americans of the Kentucky Borderlands database, which focuses on enslavement and freedom seeking in Kentucky. The second one is from Guildhall in East Hampton, New York. Their project is Guildhall Community Artists in Residence First Literature Project, and involves collaboration with a community-based language revitalization group on Shinnecock language research in order to create 2 immersive orations. Wow, that's a cool project and a lot to say. A lot of words there. Third is a Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Their project, Resurrecting Voices, the Philadelphia Black Experience, will be the creation of an oral history podcast series that will explore Black history in Philadelphia in the 19th and 20th centuries. The fourth is Houston Community College System of Texas with their project, The Prisoner Experience in the South, 1866 to 1940. They'll explore the connections between enslavement, convict labor, and leasing, and contemporary mass incarceration. Students will produce individual and collective projects throughout a range of courses. And finally, the University of New Mexico, their project, Remember the South Broadway, Albuquerque, New Mexico's oldest African-American community, and they'll produce a substantial digital zine to document and amplify Albuquerque's earliest African-American neighborhood for University of New Mexico's courses, K-12 classes, and the larger public in New Mexico. Please join me in welcoming our CCDI awardees. They all, and they are all coming on stage. Please note that there'll be presentations, and then there'll be a QA session after the presentations. And for virtual attendees, you can place your questions in the Q&A feature at any time during the presentations. So our first one is Boone County Public Library.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Our project is the African Americans of the Kentucky Borderlands. Our team consists of myself, Liza Proxima, my digital librarian and database management, Holly Hall, and our intern, Alicia Burnett. We partnered with Northern Kentucky University for this project. As of the last academic year, NKU had nearly 16,000 students from 65 countries. They offer over 3,700 different degrees, ranging from associates to doctorates. Our organization, the Boone County Public Library, we actually come from the Borderlands Archive and History Center at the Boone County Public Library. The History Center is in the process of compiling a comprehensive collection of Boone County's history. We are working on providing access to that history in multiple formats to reach beyond just our local area. In 2017, BCPL was recognized as a National Park Service Network to Freedom affiliated member, both as a research facility and a program for our Underground Railroad bus tour. We have received several Network to Freedom funded grants and various awards for our African American research.
This project stems from our search of more comprehensive history of African Americans in Boone County. When our local history department was started, very little was known in the county's history, specifically of African Americans. We only knew of a few hundred enslaved people. Now we have identified thousands, along with cemeteries, churches, family members, and events such as baptisms and escapes. With this project, we want to continue that work and expand our digital repository. Alicia is searching in various LOC databases and collections to identify people, dates, and locations associated with enslavement and freedom-seeking events. The information collected will be entered onto spreadsheets with metadata elements established specifically for our Omeka sites. The spreadsheet is saved as a CSV file and uploaded into the database and then made available to the public from our digital repository. We know that the story of freedom seekers is quite intricate. We see the movement through the United States and even into Canada in our records. We need to look beyond our county if we want to capture more of the story. Alicia's work will allow us to access to information on freedom seekers and their descendants who are associated with Kentucky and tell more of their story. The CCDI project will allow our organization more opportunities for outreach in our community. Using the data collected, we'll create a digital exhibit to share African American experiences with the general public and educators. Please link to our current digital exhibits from the QR code displayed. In addition to digital exhibits, we will create a landing page detailing the CCDI project and the data we're able to extract from the LOC collections.
So some of the materials that we plan to use include digital collections, obviously, including, but not limited to, the Born in Slavery slave narratives from the Federal Writers Project. We are planning to look in newspapers, such as the Frederick Douglass newspapers, reference the e-resource online catalog, and online sources such as the African American History Resource Guide that's provided on the website of the Library of Congress. We also hope to look in non-digital collections while we're here at Summerfuse. And finally, we look to engage with the Library of Congress staff using one-on-one help with database techniques, asking what keyword searches we could use to increase our search, ask a librarian that's offered on the website, as well as engaging with the CCDI team through meetings. Thank you.
Akwene tampak, wanitin wikwai na dasuis, Shinnecock Natasha Ayamkatuank, ka Shinnecock Natap. Hello everybody, thank you for being here and supporting the work of our amazing cohort. It's really touching to see the types of projects that everybody is getting into and what kind of impact it's going to have on the community, so thank you for your support. I am a representative in this capacity of Guildhall as a community artist in residence. I'm from the Shinnecock Nation on the east end of Long Island, New York, and my work centers on the revitalization of our language, which is currently critically endangered. However, the beauty of our words and the connection to our ancestors still persists this day in many avenues, many venues outside of our regular everyday spoken speech. We're working on bringing that back, and there's a lot of enthusiasm, and I just really appreciate the CCDI team's support. The Guildhall Community Artists in Residence program has provided an outlet and a space and support for artists within our community, including our Indigenous community on the east end of Long Island, to really develop their projects and to interact with a wider community of artists and folks who really can make a difference in moving these projects forward. So thank you very much, Guildhall. I appreciate that. We are currently working on a project, it's called the First Literature Project, in which we are establishing a company that is focused on giving a platform to Native voices so that we can tell our own stories without having to go through a filter of anthropology or some other institute. My collaborator, Christian Scheider, is a filmmaker from the east end of Long Island, and in this partnership, he is really playing a vital role in our development of our film, our digital assets, and really coordinating and facilitating a learning environment as we hire on Native artists as well, Native filmmakers as well, to really bridge that gap that sometimes exists between our communities. We're also working with the Potawatomi Medicine Lodge, and this is an organization founded about 20 years ago now. And it's a philanthropic organization based on the reservation, and it's from us, it's by us, it's about us, and it's for us. And you know, for the Shinnecock Nation, that's really an important, it's an important institute because it provides services, it provides assistance with housing, education, and basic needs of our people who sometimes fall through the cracks, especially before we were federally recognized in 2011, I think it was. The Ayamkatuank is a group of 4 young women from the Shinnecock Reservation who are all accomplished in their own right in their careers and their interests. And they have committed to helping me get our program off the ground. We are currently in the stage where they're receiving training. So our program is basically going to be an extension or an experimentation with a language revitalization plan that I'm putting together as part of my doctoral work at the University of Arizona. So this language nest idea is really meant to provide resources to these young women so that they can take the language, their language research, and their projects, the things that they create into different avenues and into different settings. We have people who are involved in early childhood education. We have a young woman who's involved in advocacy and even worked here in DC for quite some time. We have artists and we have environmental caretakers as well. So what we are trying to do with this project is to really meet people where they are and make these resources available. It's really been quite a challenge to get to the point where we are. Personally, I've had to leave New York and go all the way to Arizona to learn my own language, and that's not acceptable. And it's not acceptable to only have language learning happening in academic institutions. So we are really working hard on diversifying our method of transmission of the language and really breathing some light into it, some life into it, and making it fun and exciting and engaging and something that people want to bring home and do not feel intimidated about. that can really be an issue in a lot of Native communities because our language is so closely tied to our identity, which has been under attack for 400 years. So I'm so proud of these young women who are helping us. We have Cholena Smith, Lucina Uncle, Ahanu Valdez, and Keisha Hale. And we're really just beginning the work here, and it's very, very exciting. I just want to take a moment to recognize my grandmother, Chichi Elizabeth Thunderbird Hale, and her father, Chief Thunderbird. They're really the inspiration for my work, and being of her family and being a recipient of her teachings, I really do feel a responsibility to continue to promote the preservation and the flourishing of our culture and our language. My great-grandfather here, he was one of the last speakers of the Shinnecock language who spoke fluently. So it's not that far gone, and it's not gone entirely either way. I am so grateful for this opportunity with the support of CCDI to really push back against that narrative of Indigenous erasure, of a dying culture or a dead language, because that is not who we are, and that is not what is going on right now. And it's a very damaging narrative, especially to the communities themselves as we internalize these colonial ideas. Yeah. My grandmother was a teacher and a matriarch of our clan, the Thunderbird clan, and her life was focused on education and uplifting the people. So with this project and in her honor, I hope to provide training that we need for our students and have those trainees then go out and create their own versions of whatever it is that they want to do with the language and really put the direction in their hands. We're going to be conducting Shinnecock language research here at the library. We have a very limited amount of written resources on our language, so quite a bit of it is going to be a process of comparative historical linguistics. And it's a journey, but it's fun. And we're going to be connecting with other tribes that are mostly a little bit further north because they still do have speakers and we have shared resources. As a trade language, our dialect is very similar to other dialects in the area. Part of our mission here at the library is to discover more of these resources because they can be found in unassuming places. We don't have a dictionary of Shinnecock language, and it's something that we're working on, but we are looking for any piece of information, any documentation of our language, any interaction, and they can be found in memoirs, in legal documents, in land transactions, and we are just hoping to connect with those resources, whatever they have here at the Library of Congress. In addition to heavily focusing on what we can find in text, we are also preserving oral traditions through recordings. We are creating a digital archive of our people telling stories that they want to have preserved for future generations. This digital archive is going to be controlled by the Pataquohan Medicine Lodge, so it stays in-house, and we can just continually add to it and make available a body of research that is specifically about Shinnecock people, which has been very hard to find outside of anywhere, actually, in general. Our language is a gift. It was created by our ancestors, and it encapsulates a worldview that is specifically Shinnecock, it's specifically Indigenous, and it's invaluable. And it's something that has been under attack for so long that it's time to really proactively encourage these young people in their efforts to reconnect or continue the connection that we have not lost with our culture and our language, and really honor our ancestors and their lives and everything that they've given to us. Here are some of the few resources that we have. We'll really be working from a lot of historical texts. Our primary resource is a book of Genesis. It was written in 1655. So there is a whole lot that goes into this work. There's a lot of emotional work that we need to do as we're reading these texts that were written so early on, and there are a lot of things that we need to, a lot of considerations that we have while approaching these texts that were written so long ago. But we're very excited to do it, and what we make out of our interaction with these primary resource documents is going to be something that's accessible to the community on an individual level. Okay. I just want to say thank you again very much for being here, and thank you for listening to me speak. Tabane.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here, and especially thank you to the Library of Congress and the CCDI team for hosting us and awarding us this grant, which allows us to pursue this project. My name is Selena Bemak, and I'm the Programs and Communications Coordinator for the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, also known as HSP, which you'll hear me refer to it as. I'm joined today by my colleague, Katie Bodenhorn-Barnes, who's the Director of Genealogy for HSP, and together we are working on a pilot podcast titled Resurrecting Voices, the Philadelphia Black Experience. Like I mentioned, our project home is the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Founded in 1824, HSP is one of the nation's largest archives of historical documents, with over 21 million manuscripts, books, and graphic images encompassing centuries of U.S. history, and it is also one of the largest family history libraries in the country. The collections at HSP document the experiences and representations of African Americans from the colonial era to the present, which, alongside the Library of Congress collections, will serve as the basis of this podcast. So as the pilot podcast for the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, we hope Resurrecting Voices will help us do a number of things. Firstly, we hope to continue amplifying Black voices, as we have done already through public programming and organizational partnerships. As we look to expand our digital initiatives, we hope this project will also live on in an evergreen format. We also hope to contextualize Philadelphia history and highlight local public historians and scholars who are already doing a lot of this work, and extend our general history interested audience through a modern, accessible format featuring colloquial language.
And finally, we aim to serve as an entry point for budding family historians, which is one of the largest audiences that we serve at HSP. Many of the same kinds of historical records that we use to trace these prominent individuals can also be used to reconstruct the lives of ordinary citizens. We have found that in addition to its inherent emotional value in making meaning, genealogy is a successful gateway in getting people interested in history, and in today's volatile political and educational climate, this is critical.
So the initial run of this podcast will take place over 5 episodes, with the inaugural episode slated to air in fall of this year and continue into 2024 against the backdrop of HSP's bicentennial anniversary. Through the launch of Resurrecting Voices, we aim to spotlight our guest speakers who range in profession and expertise on Philadelphia Black history. We also will have historical and interpretation and storytelling featured in each episode, curated by a scholarly advisor based on research conducted at both of our institutions, the Library of Congress and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania.
Additionally, a major component of each episode will be professional genealogical advice and commentary. Not only are we providing historical background for our audience to understand the context in which their ancestors lived, we're also preparing them to move forward with the next step in their personal genealogy journey. We feel that a critical part of the act of resurrecting voices is empowering the public to resurrect the voices of their own ancestors. And part of our goal with this podcast is helping others to know that telling the stories of our past people is not limited to the prominent or famous.
This project is one born out of past collaborations, and we are working with a number of organizations and individuals who will lend their expertise and contribute as guest speakers. And this includes our peers from the African American Genealogy Group of Philadelphia, the African American Museum in Philadelphia, and the 1838 Black Metropolis, which formed out of the Black Docents Collective. Together and apart, they are already stewarding Philadelphia Black history, and this podcast is an opportunity to extend their reach. Resurrecting Voices will focus primarily on significant events, influential figures, and cultural and social movements in 19th and 20th century Black Philadelphia. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania maintains an extensive history of programming in the subject area, which we hope to now translate into our podcast. And each episode will feature a different topic. So for example, one episode we may draw connections between wealth and abolition as we look to the Fortens, the Purvis, and the Still families who participated and funded organizations such as the American Anti-Slavery Society, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, and the Vigilance Committee. We will also review topics like early 20th century arts and culture, analyzing the works of musicians and artists like Paul Robeson, Doc Thrash, Marian Anderson, Henry Tanner, John Coltrane, and dozens more. And we'll consider the influence of African American education in both the 19th and 20th centuries, with an examination of leading institutions such as the Banneker Institute and the Institute for Colored Youth, which is now known as Cheyney University, the first HBCU in America, and the Ashman Institute, now known as Lincoln University, the first college degree granting HBCU. As previously mentioned, each episode will draw on source material from our collections as well as the Library of Congress's, which complement one another in scope. These materials at the Library of Congress will help us not only understand African American life in Philadelphia, but also contextualize the city's role in a changing nation. So some of the key collections that will support our podcast include the Black History Collection, featuring materials related to William Still and William Whipper, the William Gladstone Afro-American Military Collection, the Frederick Douglass Papers, especially as we think about Douglass's arrival in Philadelphia in 1838 and his influence on Philadelphia area abolitionists, the Marion Carson Collection, the Lorenzo Green Papers, and of course the records of the NAACP.
And we will also, of course, rely heavily on the Library of Congress's digital content. We plan to draw information from online resources such as the Civil Rights History Project, the Chronicling America newspaper database, and digital projects like the Great Migration and Going North. African American Perspectives is also a particularly promising digital resource for us, as there are 38 Pennsylvania-specific rare digital books on a variety of socioeconomic topics, and most are Philadelphia-centric, written by Black authors.
Many of the collections and digital content mentioned will also serve as supplemental to the podcast, and we will direct our listeners to inquire further within the library's collections if they seek more information. So our project team consists of myself as Programs and Communications Coordinator for the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I will serve as the primary host of the podcast, offering an introduction and conversing with our guest speakers.
And I will contribute as a co-host, offering a genealogical perspective at the end of each episode for listeners who can then choose to follow up with me personally via private consultation. We want our listeners to have the tools to conduct research as citizen historians and to understand their family's place in the larger historical narrative.
That said, the bulk of content will be delivered by our guest speakers on our podcast. Our team is also supported by Chris Myers, who serves as our grant manager, and we are in the process of contracting a scholarly project advisor who specializes in African American history. This person will perform light research, develop talking points, and fact-check our scripts, and we will also hire an audio technician and researcher who will assist with recording, editing, and other technical tasks. We have and will continue to use the CCDI team as a vital resource in the planning and execution of this project. Senior Innovation Specialists Kimber and Brian especially have offered support and suggestions for the technical aspects of launching a podcast, serving as anchors to the library for us.
So as we move forward with Resurrecting Voices, we also hope to engage with the librarians here at the Library of Congress, who we hope will provide direction and focus within the library's vast collections. Thank you.
Thank you.
I am with Houston Community College, and our project is the Prisoner Experience in the South from 1866 to 1940. I am Dr. Teresa Jack. I'm the project lead, and I'm a history professor at Houston Community College. And then supporting the grant are Dr. Nathan Smith and Dr. Helen Graham. And Dr. Graham in particular is a genealogy expert, and she's going to be helping us with that aspect of it. And we're really fortunate to have a great group of faculty from many different disciplines. And this is something that I always wanted to do, but it never quite could come together. And this grant gives us that opportunity, right? That we can bring people from our other groups outside of history to work on this project with us. And so we have great participating faculty. We have Natalie Garza in history, Kate Phillips in film production, Christopher Williams in music, Tracy Valentine in English, Victoria Dorsch in history. We have Rolanda Teal, anthropology, Elizabeth Denham, history, Rosarda Haxalari in geographic information science, which is, she's gonna help us with our story map, so that's really cool. And Melinda Lazkazinski in art, and Sinitra Williams in English. So just a little bit about Houston Community College. So we're in Houston, Texas. We are a minority serving institution. We are one of the most diverse cities in the country. We are the 5th largest community college system in the United States. As I said, majority minority serving. We are going to involve faculty and students from across 23 different campuses, and we have over 69,000 students and over 2,500 faculty. So we're a big spread out institution. And for this project, we're gonna focus on the humanity of the men, women, and children that were incarcerated across the South that were victims of a very brutal Southern prison system. We want to find out what their everyday lives were like, what they experienced, how they built community while they were incarcerated, how they resisted oppression while they were in prison. And when I proposed this project, my own research is on convict leasing and prison farms in Texas, and I've been involved in various ways in the Sugarland 95 project. And for those of you who may not know about this, in 2018, a convict cemetery was discovered on the campus of a Houston area school in Fort Bend County. It's a suburb, and Sugarland, which is where Imperial Sugar comes from, and they used all convicts on their sugar plantations there. They were building the school. They knew that it was prison property. They had been told by historians, by activists, that there was probably a cemetery there. And as they got ready to do the 3rd wing of the school, they found 95 remains. And so that Sugarland 95 is gonna inform a lot of our students' work. And so that image you see up on the top right is from that final report from the Sugarland 95, and I actually wrote like the historical context for that report. And then on the bottom right is an image of some leased convicts actually in Sugarland during the period of our cemetery. So our students are going to use the Library of Congress digital collections to research the history of Southern prisons. We're going to use it to inspire art, creative writing, music, filmmaking, podcasting, whatever our students are going to want to do through this. They are going to work on a digital story map that is not only going to give them a lot of valuable technology skills that they can use after college, but also it is going to enrich those stories of people that are often dehumanized or just seen as a statistic or a victim. We want to have them seen as full people and in a way that will be easily accessible to the public. So our goals are going to include helping our students understand the history of the Southern carceral system and to gain empathy for the victims of that system. We are going to create and share lesson plans with other educators that we're going to house on a website that will have links to Library of Congress sources as well. And we are going to host an end of project public exhibition, which is going to showcase our students' work. I'm really excited about that. It's going to give them a chance to show off what they've done, to bring their parents, bring their neighbors, bring people in to see it. We'll invite local media and whatnot so that they can really shine. And our main goal, our main source for the project is going to be the Alan Lomax collection at the American Folklife Center here. And it includes hundreds of photographs from Southern prisons. It includes recordings of prisoners singing work songs, and it also includes recordings of various blues musicians, including Leadbelly, which he's pictured in the center, kind of in the lighter colored shirt in the front. He was incarcerated both in Sugarland, Texas, and in Louisiana. His real name is Hootie Ledbetter, but they call him Leadbelly. And when he was incarcerated in Sugarland, the governor of Texas at the time, Pat Neff, was doing a tour of the prisons, and they had him perform. And one of the things he did is he wrote a song asking for a pardon from the governor. So it's like a whole song about give me a pardon, and he actually did, and Neff hardly pardoned anybody. So this was really great for him. And then there are also lots of documents about Southern prisons in general in the library collection. So there are reports and inspection reports and all sorts of things that we'll be able to use. And so the Library of Congress staff is going to help guide participating faculty in their research in the digital collections so that our faculty in turn can guide our own students. And so we're really excited to work with them and grateful for that. And this very last image here is from the Lomax collection, and it's a man known as Leighton in Washington, and he's at the Darrington Prison Farm in Texas, and that photograph is from 1934. And again, these are the kind of photos that will be inspiring our students and our colleagues to work. And so everyone at HCC is really excited about this project and excited to work with the Library of Congress and all of the wonderful people here. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm here on behalf of Dr. Natasha Howard. My name is Olivia Dorsey. I'm a program specialist for the Connecting Communities Digital Initiative that basically amounts to doing a lot of coordination across all of the different sub-projects in our program, including communications, as well as work with our interns. So I will do my best to represent Natasha as best I can. Unfortunately, she was unable to join us today. Dr. Natasha Howard is an assistant professor with a joint position in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies and the Department of Africana Studies at the University of New Mexico. For her project, the title of the project is Remember the South Broadway. This project will be a digital zine of the oldest African-American neighborhood in Albuquerque, New Mexico, established in the early part of the 20th century. The neighborhood was home to former Pulitzer Prize winner Ralph Bush. South Broadway was also home to one of the oldest NAACP chapters in the country, having been chartered in 1915. The neighborhood has had a challenging history and has changed within recent decades, yet it continues to represent an important historical memory for many current and former African Americans. This project will highlight African American memories and placemaking in Albuquerque, New Mexico. African American memories of South Broadway challenge the normative representation of New Mexico as a tricultural, Anglo-Hispanic, and Native American space. And here is an image called Healthcare is a Right, Not a Privilege, by a lead muralist, Joe Stephenson, and mural apprentices, named here. Dr. Howard is the lead PI for this project. She began working on collecting oral histories of current and former Black residents of South Broadway back in 2019. This became sidelined by the 2020 pandemic, but by then she had talked to 40 people and edited their accounts into a short documentary film. To create this digital zine project, she will work with graduate students at UNM, specializing in digital media and consulting with a digital media professor. She is a faculty member in 2 departments, as I mentioned previously, geography and environmental studies, as well as Africana studies. Her work is situated within Black geographies, scholarship, and human geography more broadly. This project fits her research because it seeks to make Black geographies more visible. She came to New Mexico as a student in the 90s. One of the most consistent stories she was told was that Black people weren't really part of New Mexico's history. New Mexico was a multicultural space without Black people. As a student, she worked for the Africana Studies program, and her job was documenting Black history in the state. That was her first introduction to Black history in New Mexico. Much of the work was hidden in archives or tucked away in people's homes. She organized what she found to create a traveling exhibit. The work that she started as a young student stayed with her through grad school and a PhD program. Years later, she thought the story of Black urban communities like South Broadway had been overlooked. The residents were still alive, and as she spoke with them, they continually mentioned that they feared that the city's Black history was being ignored and made invisible in its efforts to rebrand the city as a multicultural, non-Black space. This project is an attempt to digitally represent African Americans' long and rich history in Albuquerque. Dr. Howard's research area is the tiny community of South Broadway in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This community sits just southeast of the Central District and is bound by the railroad to the west, the highway to the east, and 2 other neighborhoods to the north and south. The community was at one point predominantly Black because of the city's restrictive housing covenants. At one point, it was the only place Black people could live in the city because of non-Black housing codes. Today, there are few Black residents. Like many places, gentrification and a significant period of home foreclosures have changed the neighborhood's demographics. However, still many Black residents talk about the importance of Black history in this neighborhood, which they hope will be memorialized before it's too late and they are forgotten. Remember the South Broadway is a digital zine project which will tell the history of Albuquerque, New Mexico's first African-American neighborhood, South Broadway. The purpose of the zine is to document the African-American historical perspectives in New Mexico between the 1930s and 1980. The digital zine project will be an engaging, interactive way for users to learn about the Black experience in New Mexico. To create this guide, she will draw upon a variety of resources, including an extensive oral history collection that she started in 2018, as well as local and community archives, some of which are of private collections from community members, and of course, the vast digital collections available at the Library of Congress. This digital zine will require the user to think beyond the typical tricultural narrative about New Mexico and engage with Black people's historical presence in the state. This digital zine is especially important for public educational programs, which typically look for engaging ways to teach about Black people's histories each February and June in observance of Black History Month and Juneteenth. To date, there has been no digital project of this kind on New Mexico's African American population. The project will extensively use digital collections at the Library of Congress on African American lifeways, civil rights activism, and migration histories. The digital zine will be interactive and freely available on the web. The zine will focus on 4 periods in South Broadway's history. 1, migration from the South to the Southwest in the 1920s. 2, building a Black neighborhood from the 1930s to the 1950s. And 3, civil rights and African American activism. The Library of Congress's collections are essential for this project's completion. Dr. Howard plans to use the following archives: the Civil Rights History Project, NAACP, a century in the fight for freedom from 1909 to 2009, the Gladstone Collection of African American Photographs, the African American Mosaic, Migrations, Great Migrations, Finding Pictures, African American Perspectives, African American Communities in America's Cities. Dr. Howard has also met with one of CCDI's interns, Erica Quinones, who has reviewed a number of collections and created an Excel spreadsheet of relevant materials within the collections. She says thank you to Erica for her assistance. The library staff have been wonderful and provided opportunities for fellows to connect with other researchers doing similar work and can serve as a guide or sounding board. She looks forward to continuing to work with such dedicated staff. Thank you. Okay. Wow. So that was a lot. I just want to see, can we give another round of applause to these amazing awardees? I don't know about y'all, but I am so excited to see what they're going to be creating this year with us, and to see where their projects go. There's so many different connections and themes across all of their works. I just think it's incredible that this opportunity has brought them together and has brought you all together to be able to see this happen. So now I'm going to jump into the Q&A just to ask them a few questions. But before I get into my questions, I want to see if our audience, virtual or in person, has any questions for our awardees.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
We don't have any questions yet from our virtual audience, but I wanted to share with everyone up on the stage that they did give you a digital round of applause just now. And we also had a comment from an educator at MCC, which is Metropolitan Community College, about how excited they are for students in their first year English composition course to learn more about HCC's project with CCDI.
Awesome. Any questions from our in-person audience?
Aspects. There we go. Can you hear me? And how you see each of your communities like defying stereotypes through the work and how it's promoting future perspectives of these individuals.
Can I answer this? I think that's a great question, and I think that ties in directly to the title of our podcast, which is called Resurrecting Voices. And I think there is such a large emphasis already on the history of enslavement, which is important, but especially being in Philadelphia, there are such rich, diverse narratives coming out of our city and elsewhere, obviously, and we're aiming to highlight that, especially with a lot of the recent projects that have been done. So I mentioned something very briefly called the 1838 Black Metropolis. And that is now a nonprofit organization run by a great group of women formed out of the Black Docents Collective. But that started with them coming into our reading room and doing research, looking at surveys. And they looked at a survey in 1838 from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which documented this ward in Philadelphia, which was just ripe with wealth and business and education, and there's a lot of recognizable names that appear in the survey, but that never would have been documented if the Pennsylvania Abolition Society had not done that. And I think it's important to tell those stories now, especially as people are doing their ancestries and wanting to learn more about who they are descended from, but also the communities in which they lived, and more about their cities and the role that Black people participated in society. So I think that's a really important question, and I'm glad you asked it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. Hello, hello. I think that is a very important question, and I think it's important to continuously ask that question with any work that's going on in communities and that has a direct impact with communities. One thing that I really appreciate about Guildhall at this moment is that they are in the process of a shift And I believe that they're shifting in a very good direction, which is much more inclusive and really celebrates our art and our connection to each other. And it takes sometimes societies or communities that are thought of as in a box, like in history. This is what it is. This is a definition of who these people are. And it's really changing that, and it's really expanding on that and bringing it into a much more appropriate and modern light. Another context in which this project is changing the dynamic is the relationship between academia and Native communities, particularly linguists and Native communities. With Algonquin language research, it's predominantly been run by hetero white males in academia who are above the age, I'm not going to say anything else. But it's a difficult environment to engage with at all. And the truth of the matter is, historically, they didn't want us there either. So we have been relegated to a category that is not appropriate for our language researchers, our keepers of knowledge, our traditional folks who are keeping oral tradition alive. And that is not what's valued in academia, and that's not what's funded for the most part. I think that this project really brings the linguistic research and the preservation of oral tradition back into the hands of the community. And the fact that they're being supported really enables this work to happen, because it's difficult to live out there. We need funding for this type of program, and we need the freedom to determine what our program is going to look like.
So for me, when I study prisons in the carceral state, convict leasing, prison farms, it's just statistics, victimization over and over again. And so what I'm trying to do with this project is bring these people alive. And that's going to build empathy, which I think is really important for our students, and also considering that many of my students, because we're in a large urban area, and I have students that have family members that are incarcerated, and what that does to them. And so it's something that if you can see that they were not bad people, that they were part of a system that put them there specifically, then it is something that I think can get past some of that shame. When they do genealogy research and they hit a wall and they're embarrassed, and they shouldn't be, right? So that's something that's really important to me, to be able to bring that into my students.
To kind of piggyback off of that, so we've done quite a bit of research on African American enslavement and freedom-seeking events, and it's been put onto a database, as we showed in our presentation, that's allowed families in Boone County and outside to start doing genealogy. It's finally out there for them to access from wherever they are. We've gotten inquiries from Canada, New York. We even had somebody call us from France trying to do research. So it's finally out there in a solidified manner, but we're also using that research to do other projects. Of course, it's not just one, it doesn't stop there, but it's bringing it to the public in a form where they can see it. It's not hidden somewhere. So we have an African American section of a cemetery that is finally getting a headstone acknowledging those that are buried there, because there's maybe a handful of markers there with no names, and it's just an open plot. And so the research that we've already done, and then this is helping us continue that, is allowing us to do that and put it in front of the public. And it's also going to allow us to get Kentucky on board as well. So not just Boone County, but the whole state.
Any other questions from our in-person audience or our virtual audience? I have a question for you all. As I mentioned, there's so many different themes throughout all of y'all's projects. So many different overlaps and different layers to those overlaps. One of the things I've been thinking about is like the idea of storytelling and oral histories and how that relates to the work that you're doing. So I guess a general question for all of you, in particular HSP, of course, but what do you think it is about storytelling in oral mediums that can make history so engaging to people?
Katie, do you want to answer?
Sure.
I think there's a couple things involved here. One is that storytelling is, one of our oldest practices as a species, as humanity. And I think that's because of the way that it draws people in. It makes you feel like you're part of the events being described. And from a historical perspective, I know that there's a lot of folks, you hear a lot of, oh, history's so boring. At least, I encountered a lot of that. And yeah, we're a little biased though. But I think that it's a good way to bring people in and make the history relevant to them, and make it nearer to them and something that they can relate to. So that's kind of been our approach.
Something I've been thinking about today in the conversations that we have been having this morning with the junior fellows and with the panelists is about the idea of oral histories not being historically accepted tradition until very recently, but culturally that has prevailed in African American cultures and indigenous cultures in so many different ways. Storytelling and portraits, that has been a medium of passing along history. And so now it's sort of becoming more formalized in a sense, or even considered more of an acceptable format of history. And I think we're using a little bit of that credibility to host a podcast, but I think it's an integral part of that is telling stories through this format that you're able to listen and hear from someone's memory and what that means to them and the emotion behind that.
Yeah, and I think like for me, the music that we're going to be using tells a lot of stories. A lot of them were work songs sung by enslaved people that then translate into convict leasing and prison farms. So there's storytelling there. And then creating that digital story map is going to be a way to have those things accessible to the public in one place where they can click on something and then see our students' creative writing that's inspired by a prisoner's memoir or an art project that's inspired by the photographs in the collection. So there's going to be a lot of storytelling in there and telling the stories about people that don't get their stories told very often.
I feel like the storytelling humanizes the people we're talking about. They're not just names and dates on a spreadsheet. So we've done enslaved mothers research, and you could have their name, you can have their children, their families, but who are they? What did they go through? And so we're able to tell that. And so like I said, it's not just names and dates. They're a person. They have a story.
In our work, storytelling is a cornerstone of our tradition. My grandmother was a storyteller, and with that, she was able to expose a population, a non-Indigenous population, to a human side of our history. And that's something that was not available for those children at the time when she was teaching, when she was an educator. It's also extremely important that we tell our own stories and that we have access to resources to preserve them. An anthropologist or an academic is going to be interested in their own research and their own direction. And we really need to ask the people what they want to have preserved and what they are comfortable with sharing, because those are the stories that really also do humanize us. We have many, many stories that are sad, but we also have many, many stories that are hilarious. And, Indigenous people have a sense of humor too. So that's something that we have to really preserve and really promote. And I think it's something that should be preserved within our own community, but then we can also share that with the wider community.
So wonderful. What I'm picking up from this conversation too is this recurring theme of us doing the work for our community, especially for Guildhall as well. And what I'm wondering is, for you all, I know that community engagement is a huge part of your work. It's crucial to your work. I'd like to learn a little bit more about the ways in which the communities you're working with are assisting with your project, or otherwise engaging with your project, or how you hope they'll engage with your projects.
I'll start. So we really want to get the African American community in Boone County involved. They're very, I don't want to say shy, but I think they're hesitant. So we try to reach out to get input, what they want to see, what research they want. We are just right across the river from the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, so we work closely with them. Any descendants that reach out to us, we work with them, and they tell us, like, hey, this headstone is of my ancestor. It's falling apart. What can we do? So we contact that, who owns that cemetery. So we are always open, and we try to have our information out there so that they can access it through anything. So handouts, internet, because sometimes they might not be able to get to the library, so that's available. But we also have other things that are not just on the internet, so that they can reach it. And so we try to go out in the community. We try to do we did like a Juneteenth event, so and we want to just get that out there. And so we try to get community involvement as much as we can. And yeah.
I think community is at the core of our podcast project. And the community members and organizations that we have been working with are the ones who are contributing with their research and their own knowledge and expertise, but also holding us accountable. And we had some conversations with people when we were in the process for applying with the grant and asking, are you willing to, you've done this work, are you willing to come speak on the podcast? This is what we can offer you, this is what we're thinking, what do you think? And I think that's fundamental engagement with our community, in that asking for their support. And then immediately, like when we received the grant, one of the first things we did is then say, oh my God, we got the grant. Are you still going to talk on the podcast? And they were like, yes. So I think it's really important, especially as our podcast is centered on Black history, and I'm not Black, and Katie is not Black, but our guest speakers are, and that's why we want this to be a platform for them, and that we can serve as sort of a host in sorts, but say, you've done all of this research in our collections and in the collections of the Library of Congress, and now we're going to talk about it. And that is our community engagement in that aspect, aside from our genealogical community, which is a whole different beast, if Katie wants to talk about that.
Yeah, so genealogy again. With the Sugarland 95, one of the things that they did when they discovered this cemetery is they got permission from the Texas State Historical Association to do DNA testing of the remains to try and connect them with people. And so it's a process. It's not like, on CSI when you just snap your fingers and you find something out. It takes years and lots of money. So there's a lot of fundraising that's around that, and I hope our project will help with that. But they've already been able to find people, to find descendants, because, for example, one man who was buried, he died from having his arm cut off. And so they knew that that's who he was based on the description they knew that those were his remains. And then they were able to trace Dr. Helen Graham, who's my dean, also my boss, right? She was able to trace his descendants and talk to them and interview them and find out what they want done with his remains. And that's what we're trying to do on a small scale in Sugarland, but also on a bigger scale with this whole project. So.
I am so excited by the level of community buy-in that we've gotten within the Shinnecock community. we've been able to get my uncle on camera, which I never thought would happen. So we've got him. And we have more interviews coming up. We have more stories to share. And I would like to expand more into collecting photographs from people's personal collections and really talking about the lives of our ancestors and those people who are influential in holding families afloat, because for a long time that's what it was. And people who are influential in preserving the culture and promoting pride in our culture at a time when it wasn't the thing. It's very interesting. It's an interesting dynamic coming from a history where our culture and our language had to somewhat go underground to be kept safe, and now we're in the process of bringing it up. Oh, that sounded... it had to be hidden away to be kept safe, is what I'm trying to say. And now we're at a point where we've always been proud of who we are, but we did have to navigate living in colonial New York, and it was difficult. And I think that we're at a point where people are beginning to feel comfortable to share those things that they had kept hidden and safe. And with the level of participation that we have gotten so far, I can only see more participation coming in, so it's very, very exciting.
Olivia, can I ask a question? So my question is for Teresa, and I'm thinking about your project and how you might think it will impact, or how you hope it might impact the current state of mass incarceration, and what might you do to involve incarcerated people with the project, whether it's through Inside Out programs, et cetera, if you've thought about that.
Well, I am in Texas, so remember that. One of the largest carceral states anywhere. And I hope that by seeing the origins of the carceral system in Texas and in the South, that students and the public will be able to look at it and say, you know what, this was a system designed to criminalize black behavior. That's what it's for. It's not that they did anything wrong, it's that they wanted their labor and they were gonna find a way to exploit it, to recreate forced labor. And that if you continually saw people of color being incarcerated, that the general public then thinks that all people of color are criminals, and it just perpetuates itself. And that leads us into the system that we have today. I mean, there's such a direct connection, and I hope that our students, and then with the public interaction, I hope that helps them to see that and maybe be a little more empathetic, and also to maybe stop sending so many people to prison. I don't know, that'd be great, wouldn't it? But, you know, again, we are in a delicate political climate, I guess I should say, in many places in the South that don't want to face the realities of that system. So it's gonna be a challenge. Luckily, at least so far, I haven't gotten any pushback on how I teach, but I know that our K through 12 educators in Texas are under fire all the time, and it's sad for them. I feel horrible for them. Makes it difficult to teach, and we have a lot of dual enrollment students, and we do get a little bit sometimes of pushback from parents of the high school kids that don't like what their kids are being taught, so I just do it anyway.
I just want to take a moment to check in and see if anyone from our virtual audience has any questions. Does anyone from our in-person audience have any questions they'd like to ask our awardees? Okay. I do want to give the awardees some time too. Selena kind of kicked us off a little bit early. If you all have questions for each other, I want to give you some time too. Okay.
I just want to know when the Boone County website's going to be completely up and running so I can use it.
Oh, it's up and running now. Yeah. Obviously, this project hasn't gotten on there just yet. We only just started last month or so. But the research that we've already done as far as Boone County, the county is concerned, it's on there. There's a link to the virtual exhibits as well. So we do have a virtual exhibit for the African Americans in Kentucky Borderlands bus tour. So you can actually do the bus tour yourself without a bus if you wanted to. But you can follow along on that. So it tells 5 stories throughout the county. There's also a virtual exhibit of that I did for African American or Black History Month. So that talks about not just Civil War era, but goes into the civil rights and U.S. colored troops. There's about African American education and employment, so music, so it touches on a few subjects. There is the enslaved mothers story map. That's on there. There's videos about their stories. So that's all on there. So yeah, if you just look up bcpl.org and go to Archive and History Center, you can find all of our stuff that we already have up there. It's up and running.
That's fantastic. I do have a question for you, Winnetu, for Guildhall. So I know that you all are working with 3D technologies, virtual reality, and the library's own innovator in residence, Jeffrey U. Warren, is currently working to develop a 3D reconstruction of the erased Chinatown in Providence, Rhode Island. How do you think that immersive technologies can help people connect to ancestral spaces and traditions?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. It has always been my dream to look out over the bay from Shinnecock and not see mansions and bridges and roads and development, and knowing that our territory extends so far in both directions on the island. The island's very narrow, so it extends to the west to Ayamkatuank territory and then to the east to Montauk territory. And we have 800 acres that we live on that less than half of our people can fit on. And our sacred places are a playground for the rich, unfortunately. And it's been a long fight. It's been a hard fight. And there was a photograph up before of my Aunt Becky, Rebecca Genia, and she's an activist. She's a warrior. And she's been working tirelessly on graves protection and reclaiming sacred spaces. And along with a couple other folks from the reservation, we've been doing a great job of getting people into school and developing our own lawyers and our own teachers and our own advocates. And unfortunately, this is the way you must participate in the system to make some progress. So that's where we are. But we just recently regained access to one of our most sacred places. It's called Sugarloaf Hill in English, and it is a mound that was built over the course of a few thousand years by our ancestors carrying sand, and that's why it's Sugarloaf, because it's white on top. And it's a burial place where we took leaders from our community, but also folks from other tribal communities came to that place to be buried there. And up until the 60s, I believe, we did have access to that space, but when the railroad came through the area, there was a transfer of land which was called eminent domain, I believe. But what it did was bisect our territory and take most of it. And that's where our burial grounds were. And it's prime real estate out in the Hamptons. So when Sugarloaf was taken from us, and it's not even that long ago, a mansion was built on top, a pool was built on top, and Shinnecock people who went to pray were arrested or threatened and chased off. And my aunt was telling me a story of when she was younger. her mother would say, go up there anyway. Go up there anyway. We'll go at night. We'll get there. We'll do it. Don't forget that this is our territory, that these are our ancestors, and we can't give up on them, no matter how daunting it is, fighting these people who have so much money and can keep us in legal battles for years and years and years. We've made progress, and I think that with Sugarloaf being the subject of our first VR presentation, our first oration, it is a story that my grandmother wrote in English, because English is what she spoke, and my mother and I have translated it back into Shinnecock. So we're going to be speaking this story that my grandmother wrote using Shinnecock language and making concrete the point that our history did not start at contact on the East Coast. We have an entire rich history pre-contact, and with the VR technology, we are going to be transporting the viewer from a modern context into a historical place that is so familiar to them. As coming out to the East End, people know the landscape, but there's no more mansions. We're gonna take those out. Sugarloaf, the actual building is down. The actual building is down, and we're working on doing what we need to do to honor the ancestors. And the best that we can do for the rest of the island is do a VR editing of sorts.
And if I could just, because we had some very similar with the Sugarland 95, right? That a lot of the people in the community wanted to just dig people up and move them somewhere else and then build a school over top of them. And the community fought back. Right? They said, this is not right. You need to put them back where they were, and we won. We put them back where they were. And then I know in my own research that I live in Fort Bend County, which is just outside of Houston, and just housing being built on prison land, because those prison farms are all over. I know that there are other cemeteries out there. We know they are. They just don't have them marked. And we know that when those suburban builders come in and they don't have an archaeologist on staff. If they find something, they're not going to report it. So we just, like, every day I drive by, there's more stuff going up, and it just makes me cringe. Yeah.
Awesome. Oh.
Thank you for your work and your presentations today. As we listen to the presentations, and particularly the Guildhall presentation, we hear the importance of pronouns, right? We are. And as people who are involved as faithful allies, storytellers from other communities, those pronouns are also, right, telling in relationship to our position, they, them. I'm wondering if those of you who are involved in the preservation of stories that are outside of your own experience, your own communities, your own ancestry, your own genealogy, the connections that are compelling and sacred in the work that we're hearing about from Guildhall, what principles you've articulated, what is public facing in relationship to your accountability to the communities you're working with, whose stories you're stewarding, and what commitments to capacity building and to empowering leadership, right, are happening in co-partnership with the communities that whose stories you're bringing to life in so many ways. What allows us to build another generation of people who can write their own grants, who can tell their own stories, who can host their own podcasts, who can be the stewards of their own collections, et cetera. How are you figuring out how to be in alignment and then produce these public-facing commitments and principles that obviously, in so many ways we're hearing, guide your work?
So, yeah, that's a tough one, and I teach African American history at HCC, and it's always like the first conversation we have in class is like, why is an old white lady teaching this class? And it's something that my students, we have to have these conversations. With the Sugarland 95 work, there was a community activist named Reginald Moore, who since sadly has passed, but he was the real driving force, and for years and years and years this man fought for this. And so I felt like my job was to just sit back and support him, to give him the historical information maybe that he needed, to help him with research if he needed it, to be at a public meeting and when everybody else was shouting him down, to be one of the people that was saying, no, listen to him, because he was right. He knew he knew that cemetery was there. He knew it was there. He just didn't know exactly where, but he knew. So it's hard. It's hard, like I even said, like the community that we won, and I feel like as an ally that I was part of that community, because I went to the city hall meetings and did all of that stuff. But the stories of the people that were actually involved, and that's why we want to get the families. So through the genealogy, to have the families, the actual descendants of these people, to be able to have some more say in it is important. So I don't have a perfect answer. It's a hard thing sometimes to navigate, and just try to do your best every day and work at it is all I try to do.
I think that's a really important question, and I'm glad you asked that. And I think as we do this work, I hope that question keeps getting asked, because who are we as an authority to tell these stories? And like I said to some people earlier, I don't think we are. We're not. These are not our stories, and we are sort of serving as the host for other people to tell these stories. But I think also coming from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and thinking about collections and that aspect that you asked too, I think we're lucky in that a lot of the collections that we have were donated to us with the idea that we are going to steward these collections on behalf of these people, these families, and everyone who's represented in the collection. And I think we take that ownership very seriously, and we try to then steward those collections, and that's how we're translating that now into our podcast. But I think at the core of our work is not trying to take a role which would take away a voice from somebody who this may be their family story, or this may be their community story. And it's more so to set the stage for someone else to kind of have those discussions and have those hard discussions with them, and keep maintaining that accountability that what is our authority in this, and is there any for us? Does that make sense? It's a hard question, but again, like I said, I hope it's one that keeps getting asked, because it's important, and not just for us, but for other people moving forward with different projects, and who is stewarding these collections. And it goes back to a question too of how do things end up where? Who do they belong to? How are they repatriated? And how are they restricted? So that's also a question as well. We could be here all day. And then Katie, you wanted to say something?
Well, I mean, I think you actually ended up covering all of it. I would just say, as a genealogist, from my perspective, I am wanting to share this knowledge. I am lucky to have knowledge of our collections and of a lot of resources that are out there, but ultimately I want to be able to empower other people to be able to do this, and that's my ultimate goal. Is, as Selena said, it's not to be the person that tells these stories, or that's not my job, but to help people gain the tools. Since I have that knowledge, I can pass that on, and then, as I mentioned in the presentation, help people become these citizen historians that are telling their own stories, that are empowered to know how, if they don't already, and just providing those resources as often as possible.
All right. We are out of time now, unfortunately. So sad, because this discussion is so good. But I would like to say thank you again to our fantastic 2023 CCDI awardees. Thank you to our audience in person and virtually for joining us today. We're going to take a break now, and we'll reconvene after the break, so stay tuned.
All right, hello everybody. I'm Kimber Thomas. I'm a Senior Innovation Specialist on the CCDI team,
And I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's conversation with Maya Cade and Dr. Andre Brock. Maya Cade is the creator and curator of the Black Film Archive, a first-of-its-kind digital archive contextualizing Black cinema currently streaming, and a scholar in residence at the Library of Congress. In July 2023, Fast Company magazine named Cade on its annual list celebrating the most creative people. The award-winning writer and curator is based in Brooklyn. Andre Brock is an associate professor of media studies at Georgia Tech. He is also a CCDI advisory board member. He writes on Western technoculture, Black technoculture, and digital media. His award-winning book, titled Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures, theorizes Black everyday lives mediated by network technologies. Dr. Brock and Maya will discuss Tenderness in Black cinema, Maya's Tenderness in Black Film Project, and the rich history of Black archival practices. Please join me in welcoming Maya and Andre.
Hi.
Good afternoon, everyone. I cannot top last year's performance where we had Dr. Hayden doing the viral moment from Usher where she was going like this.
Watch this.
But we're going to make it happen. So I have the pleasure of talking to the fabulous Maya Cade, the owner and curator of the Black Film Archive at blackfilmarchive.com. Write that down. You can go take a look at it. And I want you to take a few minutes to tell us a little bit about the genesis of the Black Film Archive and what you hope to accomplish with it.
Okay, big question. Okay. Black Film Archive began in June 2020. A lot of Black people were in the streets digitally and physically, demanding more representation for Black lives, demanding film and media represent us wholly. And of course, this is in the wake of the George Floyd's killing. And I think in that moment, I was having there were a lot of questions among my friend group, among my community online of, are Black films racist? Like, is Black films past racist? And that's an assumption that people just carried. They didn't feel like there was a place that could ask, like they could ask that, or something they could consult to ask that too, that was accessible to them. So a lot of my friends asked me questions like, okay, I want to watch early Black film history, but I don't want to watch Birth of a Nation. And I'm like, what? Like, that's a very wild jump. But instead of shaming people for what they didn't know, I kind of was like, what can I do to provide something that gives them that access, that gives them that knowledge? And I think, of course, there are books that I could point them to, but what if you don't want to read, Donald Bogle's work? What if you don't want to read scholarly text? And there obviously was a gap missing in what was available to people. And so I started a Twitter thread, and that Twitter thread really took off. And I was like, oh, wait, this is something. And one of my friends and I had a conversation, and she was just kind of like, you know more than this thread. And the thread was just a photo, a link, and the title of the film. And she was just like, you know so much about these films. Why don't you, like, she said, why doesn't someone pay you to build that? And then I said, like, why don't I pay myself? Or like, why don't I use my own time, my own resources, so I am not beholden to someone's idea of what this should be? Because I think so many ideas get caught up in institutional structures before they can even fully flourish. And I knew that what people were missing, I was kind of like, it's actually not an institutional driven thing. It's a person to community or community to community thing that I wanted to build. So the goal then, to answer the second half of your question, is always been centering Black people's way of speaking and communicating with each other, and building something that could speak to Black people directly in all the ways. So the way I considered the design of the site, the way that I considered, how I spoke about film, the films that were selected at the very beginning, the time period, everything I really thought through and said, what does this mean to Black people? And how can I be a champion of that thought instead of thinking of, oh, this is how an archive functions, because I think those are two very different Thanks.
So I have an interstitial question because I want to come back and ask you how has working with the Library of Congress helped the Black Film Archive, but I have an interstitial. So I did my Maya Cade research. I know you used to work for Criterion Collection.
I did.
And I also know you have some thoughts about the value of YouTube and other spaces as an archive. So what's different about the Black Film Archive from the commercial impetus of Criterion and from the just gotta catch it all impetus of YouTube?
Well, I would say that YouTube is not an archive, but most people treat it as an archive. So to me, I mean, so much of what I am is grabbing things from YouTube. But when I grab something from YouTube, this might be controversial, I also download it. So it exists.
That's not controversial.
So it exists. I think, you know, so many of us look at YouTube and we're like, oh, it's going to be there forever. But what is happening on the policy side is that YouTube has now decided that if this person hasn't uploaded a video in over 2 years, suddenly these things, you know, these bookmarks that we have will suddenly be erased. So, you know, a lot of my work is collating across the internet. I journey through the deepest corners of the internet to find a film. I mean, a lot of times I'm asked a question of like, oh, why isn't this here? Why isn't this here? And I'm like, I'm trying, you know. But also what separates my work from Criterion or movie or anything like that, I think it's, my work will always be free. It is not, it sees beyond the commodification of film. I think a lot of the time of how we discuss film now is, you know, even if you hear about film being discussed online, people are like, oh my God, you know, this made this in the box office, this made this, and you know, those facts are, it doesn't, facts and data like that doesn't speak to cultural currency. And I think that what I am trying to do is build scholarship around, maybe you haven't heard of this, but it means something to, it can mean something to you if you engage with it. And it meant something to a generation before you, and that has value that we should hold on to, we should treasure. And so my work speaks to that.
So in your quest to trawl the internet and find Black movies, how has the Library of Congress, being one of the first scholar in residence, how has that helped augment the Black Film Archive?
What's so interesting is, you know, when I started, it was outside of archival structures and systems. I think that the research librarians I work with, the point people I work with in CCDI, they give me probing questions that shift my work. You know, I think community archives and archives that have started outside of these systems, there's a lot of questions I now have to ask myself of, okay, there's a reason these systems exist, these archival units exist. How does that interact with my work? And it's never oh, I must do this because now I am associated with the library. It's like, oh, now I have the resources to investigate new questions, to ask myself new inquiries of like subject headings and, you know, all of the things that the Library of Congress offers. Right. And I also think that all of my research when I'm here brings me to a completely new direction that wouldn't be possible without being at the library. The very first time I was at the library for my residency, I, of course, had seen Something Good, Negro Kiss, which is a film from 1898 that came out, and it had this big moment of rediscovery, and it went viral. It's the first tender act between two Black performers. And so it said. I try not to say first, but yes. And of course I had seen that, but you know, I just started requesting all different types of films. And what's interesting is that the library's collections and what they consider a Black film is different than what I do, which also kind of became a space, an opportunity to investigate and question and reconsider and, you know, go and, you know, find my way.
Can I pick on you for a second? Can
Sure.
you talk a little bit more about the difference between how you consider Black film and how the library does?
Yes, in the moving image research, or the moving image collections, Black films are films by Black directors. And I consider a Black film, in the shortest term, to be something that has something significant to say about the Black experience. Right. So that is a film with a Black star, and it's a film directed by a Black person, but not all, which we can get into too. It could have a Black producer, Black cinematographer, et cetera. But really the true focus point is that it has something significant to say about the Black experience. So that could be anything from, yes, Birth of a Nation, to Cooley High, to, there are millions of films, or not millions, there's thousands.
It's a lot, yeah.
There's thousands of films that are included in that definition.
Like to talk about the film with Freddie Washington, Imitation of Life.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Which is not
both. Yes.
Right, directed by Douglas Sirk, one of them, right?
Yes.
Or White Men Can't Jump, right?
Yes.
Which is a canonical Black film, even though it's directed.
And that's also the other thing, right? It leaves space for what has cultural value in a way that if I just said, "Oh, this is directed by a Black person, this is a Black film," that doesn't how we relate to film. Because I have this theory that I've been developing that for Black people, film is like an heirloom. So much of how we discuss the first time we interacted with a film is, oh my gosh, my grandmother introduced me to this film. I remember going to the theater and seeing my brother and my sister with us, and we all laughed, and we went to the Magic Johnson Theater. All of this, it becomes the experience of viewing the film is as important as, and being the spectator is as important as the content of the film. And I think that definition gives space for that.
I love that. Yeah. I'm gonna lead you towards talking about Tenderness, because
yes.
I know you have a project. But one of your comments you made on talks you've given is the idea that a lot of Black films, at least of recent vintage, seem to center on trauma, right? And I would offer an anecdote in contradiction. So a lot of times.
Oh, that's not what I believe. But
I know.
Oh, okay.
No, well, I don't believe it either. And in part, I say that because I regularly expose myself to getting dragged on Twitter, because every once in a while somebody will say, "What are the top Black films you've ever seen?" And inevitably, 5 Heartbeats will come up, and I will, of course, jump in front of that and say, "I've never seen it." See, look at you. Not only have I not seen it, I'm now not going to see it because people drag me so badly about it, right? But I think heading towards Tenderness, a lot of the films that people highlight as films that they think you should see as a Black person do incorporate moments of tenderness, right? And
yes,
so could you talk a little bit about your interest in Tenderness, in part, because I've heard you talk about this before, link it to your perspective as being an optimist.
Oh, okay. I was going to say the first thing most people know about me is that I'm very optimistic. And the second thing is most likely that I really feel like a scholar of love and tenderness. And it's really a part of what I embody to my core. I think, I will back up a little bit though, because I think that tenderness scholarship, actually I'll talk about trauma for a second. I'll talk about
Tenderness scholarship? Like, there ain't that much on it.
I know, but I'll talk about trauma for a second, because the idea that I have for trauma, and a part of the genesis for Black Film Archive is a lot of people saying, "Oh my God, all Black films are dramatic. Like, what do I do with this?" And I employ the Frankie, Beverly, and Mays concept, which they have a song, "Joy and Pain," and essentially the theory in the song is that we joy and pain must coexist, because you cannot feel one without the other. And so when I think about Black film, I think about the spectrum of possibility that we must allow it to exist. There is sadness in our lives. Why would we not want cinema to portray that? There is joy in our lives. Yes, that must be a part of it too, but do we see the joys without the pain? And if I think about how much weight we put on the act of not seeing suffering, even if I think about the slavery movies that have come out, we've only explored 0.001% of what happened during slavery in film. There are not that many slavery films, contrary to popular belief. Right. And even if there were, there is still so much more to say. Why should we shy away from a part of our experience because people feel like it's negative? Representation in film is not a mirror into our lives. It's just a kind of like a window into a part of our existence. And so with that window analogy, I want to offer tenderness as a guide. In the same way that people kind of, in the way, if they are gonna talk about a listicle of Black film, that's how people are engaging. So part of me is like, what if I took that level of engagement, because a part of my research is having an annotated filmography of Tenderness. What if I took that and provided moments of tender acts? And that not being simply tender acts between, or romantic tender acts, but also community, because that's such a big part of our lives. That's also family, that's also friendship. And what if Tenderness is a guide through Black cinema? So not only just saying something good Negro kiss, but also saying how cool you high, or these two friends who really love each other until the end. And end of the film, you know? And how that was essential to the freedom that they felt with each other in life. I mean, and so many of the films that we love, even in the 5 Heartbeats, right? The tenderness that, you wouldn't know, I know, if I say so.
You say so.
The tenderness that people feel, or, you know, the act feels among each other, gives them the possibility to do, dream, and believe. And that's really what my Tenderness research, what I'm hoping to provide. So that's Tenderness.
I'm really drawn to this concept in part because I've been writing about Black joy for the last couple of years, right? And Afro-optimism, right? Which is kind of sort of where you are, but not quite. And I think you're right. We're going to go ahead and write this down. Maya Cade introduces the Frankie Beverly hermeneutic for Black affect. Right? Joy and pain, right? And so you can't, right? You can't recognize one without the other, right? And so in my arguments for Black optimism, I say that it's part of catharsis, right? And I'm stealing from Fred Moten here, where he says, you know, Black life is lived in the graveyard of the political, right? And that in such a case, Black life can be understood as being funereal, right? So the repast, or the second line, those spaces where we celebrate one another after somebody passes, but we reconnect spiritually, emotionally, right? And on other registers after that to show that we're still alive, right? And so I want you to talk a little bit about how you're developing this film project where you talk to Black directors to talk about Tenderness. How are you articulating that?
Oh, what's so interesting. So the second part of my research is interviewing Black directors about how Tenderness shows up in their work. And so it's really interesting because every time I approach someone, they're like, oh, wait, that is a part of the very essence of me. If I think about Black woman film directors specifically, because a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of people not unfortunately, but fortunately, a lot of the people I'm interviewing are Black woman directors. The very heart of Black women's filmmaking is shining a light on what is invisible to others. And to me, that's inherently tender act. And showing the ways that even from the genesis of the idea, that is tenderness. So allowing them to journey through, you know, if I think about Ayoka Shinzira, one of her earliest films is a dedication to her mentor. And it's just like, my God, you know, that is the very foundation of how you engage with cinema. So really, it's both, it's allowing space for us, both me as the interviewer and them, to recognize the ways that Tenderness is the foundation of their work. And and what I never want to do is minimize people's narrative about their own work. And so it's also giving space for them to combat with me, if that's what it is, you know. It's also giving them space to question my ideas and for us to come together to imagine new possibilities for cinema. Because I believe when we touch the past, it has infinite amount of things to yield to us. So how can we talk about their filmography? How can we talk about, you know, certain films that I'm pointing out to them and draw new conclusions, even though they think about these films every day? And so that's what I'm hoping to do with these interviews.
So a personal question.
Yes.
How does Twitter work for your expressions of the Black Film Archive?
How does Twitter work? No, it's, well.
Well, let me expand a little bit, just to go a little easier. In a previous interview, you mentioned that Black film in particular, does something different that social media can't do, right?
Yes.
In terms of representation, in terms of structure. So
Yes.
does social media have a place then to discuss the types of things that you see happening in film, or is it just a completely separate venue for expressions of Black life? Not a fair question.
No, it is a fair question. I think before I ever was a public person for film, my whole career was being a social media strategist. And I would always be employed by companies, from AARP here in DC to Criterion being my last job in that capacity. And the question I was always asked was, how can we reach our Black community online? And from that question in my professional life came Black Film Archive, right, in many ways, because I had to constantly think through ways to get these companies who maybe thought of Black communities as, oh, they're the most active online, so we need to be part of it, and really giving them a method in which that was possible.
Okay.
And so knowing how much I know about, even professionally, how to engage with Black communities, that becomes the structure in which Black Film Archive is possible.
Okay.
But to my point, how we discuss film online is in a vacuum.
I agree.
It is not something that exists. I mean, the demands in which people have for cinema digitally
have changed.
But I would also say it has shaped what is greenlit in a current context. There's so much pressure on Black filmmakers to be perfect. And the digital audience is what studios look to decide if there's going to be another film. Because instead, in a world when there was once surveys, and not to say there aren't surveys, but they're just different now. In a world there was once surveys that, allowed us to see the possibility of how an audience received something. Now studios are saying that this audience is suddenly a fully representative of how everyone feels, which cannot be true.
Right. It's like student evaluations for faculty.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's just, something I challenge everyone to really think about is social context is not the full idea of something. And how social media warps our imagination, that cannot be the world we live in and die in. We have to touch grass, And so that's really what I mean, though. Even me as a person who's a digital native, whose work is possible because of Twitter, I also know that and also the social media requires performance of us that is not our actual selves. It requires performance of our ideas that we are thinking of to an audience that cannot be the full self. And so I also, especially on the deathbed of Twitter, we're having to imagine new ways of connecting. And what I will say is what is also making me imagine new ways that Black Film Archive exists.
That's an excellent answer to a terrible question.
It was not a terrible question.
Okay, so I think that we should head into, thank you so much for these.
Oh my gosh, of course.
I've just been given the high sign that we're going to do Q&A, so we'll bring the lovely Kimber back up. And hopefully she has easy questions for Maya. Just for Maya.
Oh, all right.
Okay. At this time, we'll take questions from our in-person and virtual audience. We'll start with the virtual audience. Nothing, Sahar? Any questions from our in-person audience? And if you do have a question, we ask that you come up to the mic so that we can get you on camera.
Well, I don't know if there'll be questions anymore. Yeah. Oh, I think there's a question over here.
Okay, come on up. Come on down.
We will not bite.
I think I can just use it like this, right? Can you all hear me? Okay, cool. Andre, Maya, thank you. That was such a beautiful conversation. So I have one kind of playful question, and then another one that I'm kind of like thinking for me in my work too. So the playful question is 36 Chambers of Shaolin in the Black Archive? Black Film
36
Archive.
Chambers of Shaolin.
It's a classic Shaw Brothers karate movie.
Oh, I do have, so is it available, I don't know, is it available online?
I think so.
Oh, then I have to write it, no, but you know, the thing is, so much of
There's a
this.
Wu-Tang and...
Oh, no, but people email me all the time.
Yeah.
No, it just, I haven't come across it online, but I have a list of films in my back catalog, but I will now add this. So
Yeah,
thank you.
cool.
But I have a Kung Fu page
nice.
that I will add this to.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, because I loved your definition of black film. And I
Yeah.
was thinking of that resonance. Wonderful. I'm sadly not familiar with the work, so this is the first thing I'm gonna do when I'm not here.
Okay.
Is research the blackfilmarchive.com.
Yes.
Yes.
Blackfilmarchive.com. You could do the Black Film Archive. It goes to Black Film
Same
Archive.
place.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Great. So one of the things that I'm really concerned about with Asian American studies is the role that interracial solidarity plays in those narratives and dialogues. And I'm wondering what, if any, in the Black Film Archive that you're piecing together, what are the ways that interracial solidarity is a part of Black experience? Because that's something that everyone else is looking at for themselves.
Yeah.
And wondering, what is that conversation happening in Black film?
Well, something I think of all the time is Ossie Davis's, Third World Cinema. And one of his big directives for that was training a generation of people of color. This is in the 60s, I could be wrong. It was training a generation of people of color generally to work in the film industry. And the ramifications of that were that, or the result of that was that a generation of talent of color had the possibility to work in television. And I think what I know to be true is that Black people who believe in the mission, Black art is possible because of other people who are really champions of the possibility of an art form that is really designed to make meaningful change. Like, I think most Black artists, most Black directors believe in film as something that can make change, and that's why they are making films. I think so many of the newsreels that are possible, that newsreels of that we have in Black film, using my definition, is possible because other communities provided support for Black filmmakers to enter spaces that they couldn't otherwise, right? There really are countless examples, and not just from the talent side, but also people who financially support Black film and make it really possible, and outside of whiteness, but really other communities who make Black cinema possible. So, but that's something that I feel like should be written about more, so I will take that as a challenge to really write that, because that's such a wonderful question. Thank you so much.
We have a question from the virtual audience.
You probably can't see me, but this is for both of you. Can you speak to or share what you know about the connection between the interactive or participatory aspect of Black theater watching and the cultural experience of film?
What a great question.
Well, I will shortly say that Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte met because they were on stage at the Negro Theater. Sorry, I'm butchering the name. I'm not in front of my. But they met in Harlem. Sidney Poitier was a dishwasher. He saw an ad in the paper for a Negro theater who needed actors. He goes to the theater to act, and he says from that experience, and meeting Harry Belafonte there, he says from that experience that it was solidified that he would be an actor. He knew he couldn't live without this thing, and that comes from the theater. But beyond those two people, the first generation of Black film stars that we have, I would say the first 3 generations of Black film stars, I would even extend from that. It's possible because of the theater. If I think about early Black television, a lot of the people who participated in the television were people who were embedded in the Black community in a way that's only possible because of theater, because, to get people to view it, you want familiar faces, you want familiar people who we would idolize in the pages of Ebony and Jet, and that is theater and television and film have such an integral link that it's impossible to talk about, really impossible to imagine one without the other. And Blackness as an art form, even if I think about the career of Melvin Van Peebles or many of the Black radical filmmakers that we think of, all of these people believe in the stage as a true expression of what may not have been possible in film, but they're so informed by what theater gave them that their filmmaking changed afterwards. So it's everything. You can still.
I want to answer this question from a different register. I heard something different in what was asked, and so the idea of Black interactivity is something that I've long been interested in as a media scholar. I'm not a media scholar, but technically, right? And I think that many media scholars wrote about media being interactive without ever having gone to see a Black audience watching any film but a Black film, right? And I thought it was just Black people, and then I talked to my South Asian friends, and they're like, no, Indian people not only will have entire conversations in there, they'll bring food and have entire meals while they're inside the theater. So Black folk are absolutely interactive when it comes to a television, not to a television, but when it comes to a movie event. And people love to think of a movie theater as this sacred chamber where you sit and silently absorb all the gifts that the filmmaker is blessing you with. And Black people have always been like, no, we finna say run, right? If somebody needs to avoid danger, or we're finna talk to, oh no, that can't be what y'all about to do, right? And so one of the things I love about Twitter is, in many ways, I think Twitter recreates that interactivity. One of the first things that was written about for Black Twitter was the idea that there were Black women watching Scandal, right? And they weren't just watching it at home, they were watching it and talking about it online and reacting to the events that happened at the same time. And so this idea of Black interactivity, I think also is a moment of tenderness, right? I think of it as tenderness in that we are responding to the depictions of Black folk or anybody on the screen in ways that reaffirm our own humanity and in front of a space which is not necessarily designed for us to interact back and forth with. And so I love that question. I think about this interactivity all the time.
Okay, I realize now I misunderstood the question, but no, it's okay. But yes, just to say that I agree.
That's really interesting. I grew up in Mississippi, and my grandmother and her friends used to watch the stories, soap operas, and during the commercials, they would call each other. And talk about it.
Of course,
They
of
would
course.
discuss it, yeah.
But it's like I was saying earlier, that the act of viewing the film is as important, and being the spectator. And also, I think Black spectatorship, it's really different, because I think what Black people do when they view anything, whether it's a Black film or not, is they hold on to the parts that speak to them and forget the rest. And that is really a special relationship to media. And I think that is an inherently tender thing, because I think people can enjoy something like Imitation of Life, the first one, which is a cinematic heirloom. Literally, people, taking it and, ushering in a new generation of super fans of this film. That is the depth of Black spectatorship, and that is so sacred.
Sahar, do we have another question?
This question is for Maya.
All
Have
right.
any of the directors you've interviewed decided to release any previously unreleased films or projects?
So I'm gonna, for my Tenderness project, no. But for my work in Black Film Archive, a lot of people are asking me, can my site be a forum where work that never had its moment, whether it's, it only played at one film festival 1 year, is it possible for my site to be the forum in which that now has possibility? And so those conversations are ongoing. I will say,
Ask you to become a streamer.
not a streamer. I want to be clear. Not a streamer, but perhaps a host of some films that never had their opportunity to not even shine. Shine feels too heavy. To be seen, to be treasured.
So we don't have to rely on Tubi.
So we don't have to rely on Tubi. Yes.
We got one more.
I was already on camera. I have 2 questions, and you don't have to answer both. You can pick one.
Okay.
I'm really interested and intrigued by this concept of tenderness and the way you interpret and describe it. So I'm wondering more about your process and how you define and identify when you're watching Black films, how you identify tenderness and how it speaks to you. My second question is, how do you navigate any more technical issues, maybe regarding copyright and other barriers to access when it comes to sharing these films?
Okay, both really important and essential questions. The first one on how do I define tenderness? To me, I try to make definitions as simple as possible because I think the point of scholarship is for it to be shared and, other people to do with it what they will. And so the working definition that I have is it's tender acts as defined broadly, more than romantic, so familial, friendship, community, etc., and even with oneself. Tender acts between 2 Black people, and including oneself. And I try to make it as simple as possible because but also it's precise, because it eliminates tenderness between a Black person and a white person on screen, which eliminates a lot of films. But it also is easily understood, which I think is important. The second thing about copyright, so for my site, nothing is hosted on my site. I'm linking to things and I'm embedding, which is really important because it means that I am only the way that you see something, I am not the host of said thing. So when I'm linking to YouTube, when I'm linking to whatever it may be, I'm only the person who's telling you where to go kind of thing, which is important because that means copyright is not a question. Thank you.
Great questions.
Okay. Majesty, last one.
So my question is kind of related to the question that Selena asked.
Closer to the mic. I know you're 7 feet tall, I'm sorry.
My question is related to the question that Selena asked. So you said that you link to things and you try to embed things so it's not really you hosting it.
Yes.
In the wake of the writers and actors strikes and a lot of streaming services taking things off of their services or just kind of removing it for tax write-offs and things like that, how do you feel about preserving Black films in that way?
Well, that's a very good question. So that kind of leads me to the future of my site. So I'm in the process of, and actually my Tenderness project prompted this as much as Streaming Services Acts, but I'm in the process of redoing the site from top to bottom. And a lot of the questions that I've been able to ask myself through this work has prompted me to re-examine how I display things, how things are findable. Like, I'm trying to build a site that exists without Google, that exists and is not, because I think I always said at the very beginning that I wanted to build Black Film Archive because I missed early internet. But you know what early internet had? It had the belief that this site could exist without SEO, without, all of these things, and it isn't built with solely that in mind, but it's almost impossible to build a site now without that being the main consideration, because you want to be accessible. And I'm happy that when you Google Black film, I'm the second thing, but there is going to be a world when that isn't true. What does that mean? So and also with streaming services, it being hindered to that, what does it mean to continue to make things accessible? So in my new site, for example, I'm building something that has a log of when things were available and where it was. So there are a lot of different ways to imagine how to make something accessible, how to make knowledge accessible, and how to make films accessible. So I'm thinking really critically about that and trying to answer very similar questions to the genesis for a new circumstance. Because YouTube, Google, essentially collapsing and becoming to AI, right? Because instead of Google as a public good, it is now something that requires, or it's using artificial intelligence to predict what you want instead of it being something that is within the public good. So I'm like, what does that mean for a site that Black film across the internet is not something that is really treasured? So what does that mean for my future? And to answer your question, that's really something that's at the heart of what I am doing next. Thank you.
Awesome. This was great. Thank you, Maya and Andre. Let's give them another round of applause.
Thank you.
So hi, my name is Brian Fu. I'm another member of the CCDI team, and I'm excited to introduce Jeffrey Warren, the current innovator in residence here at the library. He'll also be today's moderator of What Now, What Next, an Asian American and Pacific Islander Digital Humanities panel discussion. Jeffrey is an artist and educator, and he's really a kind of a spiritual member of CCDI because his work really embodies everything we stand for, pretty much. And his work at the library currently includes his project, Seeing Lost Enclaves, where he is working with library staff and collections to digitally reconstruct erased neighborhoods of color, starting with historic Chinatown in Providence, Rhode Island. You can find more about his project on labs.loc.gov. So his work, along with the work of our awardees and scholar in residence, really have sparked conversation with the CCDI team as well with other staff at the library that we hope to continue today. So we're hoping to really rethink and reimagine the library's role or what it could be in supporting scholars and artists like Jeffrey and Maya, who want to use our digital resources and collections to center the lives and perspectives of, in this case, Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, and all the intricacies that entails. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jeffrey to introduce today's panelists.
Hello, you hear me? Is it amplified? Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone. And I guess I know we had a land acknowledgement earlier, but I also wanted to acknowledge the communities and nations whose lands we are on today. The Ayamkatuank, Anacostan, Piscataway, Kanoe, Pamunkey, and Manahoac people. And I guess I'll go into introductions. Forgive me as I jump around, I wrote the order a little differently, but H. Yumi Kim is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins University. She's a co-founder of the Critical Responses to Anti-Asian Violence Initiative, CRAVE. Through CRAVE, she runs a history lab called Asian Diasporas in Baltimore, which brings together students and community collaborators to help document local histories of AAPI communities in the Baltimore area. I'll switch around, sorry. Tao Lee Goff is a London-born Black British writer, theorist, and interdisciplinary artist who grew up between the UK and New York, specializing in colonial histories of race, climate, and sound technology, Dr. Goff is writing a book called After Eden on how the climate crisis is a racial crisis. She lives and works in Manhattan. Arathi Akapeti is a Telugu-American cross-disciplinary artist, coder, and educator based in Lenapehoking, Brooklyn, New York. They often use personal and institutional archival materials, combining computational and analog techniques, like machine learning and printmaking, to create artwork about intergenerational collective memory. Their creative work has been supported by institutions such as the Photographers Gallery, Ethiopia Center for Arts and Technology, Photo Museum Winterthur, and Elias Print Shop. They work as a designer-developer for the Experimental Humanities Collaborative Network, creating digital spaces and tools. Eric Hahn is Executive Director of the Music of Asian America Research Center, Curator of the Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Learning Pathway for Smithsonian Folkways, and Adjunct Lecturer at the University of Maryland's College of Information Studies. And Jason Oliver Chang is Associate Professor of History and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut, where he also serves as the director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. He earned a PhD in Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and holds a Master's in Public Policy and Administration from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He's the author of Chino, Anti-Chinese Racism in Mexico, and co-authored The Cargo Rebellion, Those Who Chose Freedom, a comic book about a mutiny in the Pacific, 13 years after La Amistad case in the 19th century. As a public servant, he sits on the Board of Education for West Hartford Public Schools, the Governor's Hate Crimes Advisory Council. At the Institute, he runs a weekly curriculum lab where UConn and high school students work with faculty and, oops, that wasn't supposed to happen, faculty and guest presenters to write K-12 lessons and modules. When he's not teaching or holding meetings, he can be found near large bodies of water. Thank you, everybody. So I prepared a number of questions that I would love to get into, and I can start off with one, but I also wanted to just, open space for panelists to speak to the news on the Smithsonian, Asian American Literary Festival cancellation, which I know has sort of upended a lot of things this past week. You don't have to say anything, but I did want to make sure that there's an opportunity. If you have feelings on that or wanted to share your thoughts, that's welcome here, okay? I guess maybe just to start with one of my questions, unless you wanted to go ahead.
Yeah, can the Library of Congress take over?
I guess we'll follow up. So yeah, the questions that I prepared, sorry, I keep gesturing with this. Some of the questions I prepared get at kind of our relationships with our research. And I particularly appreciated some of your kind of feedback on the early drafts of these questions. One is, doing research connected to our own identities can create space for the personal to show through. How did you find your voice within your work as you got into it? And you mean, I won't quote you, but I really appreciated one of your kind of comments back that there can be kind of an ethics, a scholarship, and a truth in our personal relationship to knowledge. So you don't have to start, but.
Oh, I think I do, though.
Okay.
Yes, so the panelists, just to get to know one another before this panel, we did have a conversation over Zoom. And I just happened to mention something that I think through a lot with my students, especially my students who are enrolled in my history lab course, which is a community engaged course. It's very experimental. It is not like any other course that they have taken. And one of the things that I try to set the tone at the beginning of each semester by saying that most of us in the classroom, in this particular classroom, the personal has either been a liability in spaces of academic knowledge making in elementary school, middle school, high school, college. there is a sense that bringing in the personal somehow undermines a sense of scholarly objectivity. But I think for many communities of color, the personal is where many things begin, including intellectual inquiry, and that intellectual inquiry is inseparable from your emotional experiences, your affective experiences, experiences that really can't quite be put into words. And so I think I said some variation of that in thinking about how I basically try to give my students permission for things to get personal, and that it's really okay if it does, and that it's not wrong to start with a personal anecdote in trying to think through a difficult concept or a difficult idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like that's such a beautiful way to put it, is through the question of permission. Because I think often as professors of color, especially our students of color, are coming to us for what I phrase as like a permission slip, the license to do this work. And we have to sit with the question of what does it mean to go to the archive, the colonial archive, a place like this, and to not find yourself, right? But also, we have to think about the question of legibility, because what does it mean when you do find yourself? In my research, I've actually encountered an advertisement from the 1920s of my great-grandfather who migrated from China to Jamaica, and he owned a soda factory. That was in the British Library. It's such a kind of surprise that shouldn't be a surprise when we think about the colonial history of Hong Kong having been British, and this kind of contested sovereignty for a place like Jamaica, where my ancestors are from. But in teaching classes like Yumi's, I feel that students are able to see the intellectual stakes of this work and how we are across all of these archival spaces as people of color, whether that's legible or not. So what I try to do is help people to think about the metadata for why it is that we are or are not legible. What is legible as Asian or not? And I'm often confronted by this question. And it even happened once in Chinatown in New York, where it was an oral history panel, and someone asked me, who gave you permission, Tao? Who gave you permission to write about your Chinese family as a Black person? And these are the difficult emotional questions that we need to ask and need to guide our students through, because they're not easy questions, but who is it that is entitled to grant permission is what we need to be asking.
I guess I'll just add another aspect to, thank you I agree with what both of you said. But another thing I've been thinking about is also kind of the fallacy of objectivity in the archive. I think even with something like describing an image in a catalog, there's always going to be bias and things left out, and influence from the person writing that description. And so that's what.
Yeah, I thank you for all of your comments. So I spent 18 years in academia full time, and then my primary job is now running a nonprofit. And I find that my perspective on your question has changed because when I was writing mostly scholarship, yes, I had to find my own voice. But now that I'm doing public work, I'm often thinking that I want to showcase other people's voices. And I think that's much more what I'm doing these days. So I'm doing a lot of the oral histories that are a part of this work. So yes, my voice is in there, but I'm really trying to showcase other people's voices as much as I can. So I think that's one change that I've experienced in my career as I moved from academia to outside academia.
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, thank you to CCDI and everyone who pulled us together for these amazing conversations. And thank you, Jeffrey, for moderating. Pleasure to be here on the panel with everyone. So, you know, I never thought that my story was worth researching, or I didn't ever think that my family's history was worth telling until I got into the PhD program in ethnic studies at Berkeley. And my first class was with Ronald Takaki, and we had to do a research paper about something that we could, I can't remember the metaphor he used. It was something like a road that you could build forever or something like that. And I said, oh, I'll start with my family. My training had been in Mexican-American studies, Chicano studies, and so that was a new thing for me. And I started with my grandparents, and my grandmother said to me, you need to interview someone important. And she said, you don't need to come to me. My story isn't worth saving or isn't worth being included in your PhD research. And that broke my heart that my grandmother didn't think she was valuable. And that moment changed everything for me. And like you said, you know, after you see what it feels like to chase a history and to develop it, then you want that for other people. And that's where I feel like my work's at now, is also chasing that for another generation.
Thank you all. Another thing that came up, I think that is sort of adjacent to this question, is a question that has also been addressed by other folks today, which is the challenges or the sort of dynamics of working with communities who have been systematically excluded from archives. And I'm curious how that's shaped some of your work, both in the sense of being sensitive about the instinct or the maybe the impulse, we'll say, to collect, but also in the sense of working within institutional archives that often don't really understand what they're holding. So there's sort of those two dynamics around it. You don't have to answer in order, but if that's easier, please feel free to. Yeah.
I have a surplus of mics over here, by the way, if anyone needs. I guess, well, I think for me, or that made me think of two things. One is that I've been working on a personal archive of family photographs, and also in my work, also I'm holding too many things, sorry. But also in my work, I've been doing oral history interviews with family, and this has led me to have become, I guess, a steward of these files and figuring out, being really careful and caring about how I work with that material in my art practice has been like a learning experience that was really valuable for me. And thinking about like also what to do with those files and like not making sure that they're not shared when people don't want their stories to be shared, and really like being careful and understanding that consent is like a process. And yeah. And then I forgot the second question, so but I had something in my mind.
I guess just in the sense of encountering materials that are important to your work, that perhaps you relate to, or that communities you work with relate to, but whose meanings, at least through white readings, are not fully registering. So like that perhaps the stewards don't understand the full meaning of the material that they're holding.
Oh, okay.
It can be I think.
Yeah, I mean, I have an anecdote, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I recently was in the UK doing a residency, and I visited a castle in Wales that has, I think, the largest collection of Mughal items. Yeah, I've never been so emotional going to a museum before, because it was just like really frustrating to be, as me and like one other PhD researcher were the only, and another artist actually were the only people of color there, and like the objects weren't really, like they hadn't changed the exhibition since the 1980s. The descriptions were more about like the East India Company family that owned the items, and the docents too were all volunteers, and they're from that area and are Welsh, and it made like a lot of the conversations I was overhearing was really frustrating because it didn't, people weren't able to, docents weren't able to talk about the objects themselves or where they came from, but more just about the family and like what they represent in that context. And so I think, just a lot was lost. That's what I felt, like a big sense of loss.
I mean, I think I can answer it in two different ways, right? So I mean, if I'm going to answer it in a pessimistic way, for us to solve this problem, we have to change the entire archival practice. Everything from provenance, right? In order to really get at this question. But if I'm going to answer it as an optimist, I'm going to say, why are we only considering institutional government archives as archives? People, I mean, when you look at the community archives literature, this is me as the iSchool professor comes in, they will say that community archives really started in the 1940s, but that is simply not true because people have always kept stuff, right? How you get access to stuff? Well, you have to know the community really well, right? So I think we have to think, if we want, I don't want to be in a situation that says, no, we don't have these materials available. These materials are available, we just don't know how to get there, right? And in order to get there, instead of maybe starting from reading a lot of books about this subject, maybe we need to start from getting into a community and getting to know that community very well, right? As a way to start research on a project.
Yeah, I feel like we really need to listen, first of all. And I also DJ as well as being a professor at Cornell University, and I try to push my students to engage in a kind of deep listening. And I feel like we also have to ask this question, so just following up on what you were saying, Eric, of like lost histories, untold stories, but like lost to who, right? The question of grammar was brought up earlier in terms of pronouns and who is the we and the us. There needs to be a kind of refusal of that premise about who the communities are, when this began, what was erased, and who was supposed to be responsible as the savior for this so-called lost history. Who is being listened to? What are the different levels within the archive? And it takes a lot of ethical work to be ready to tune in. And yeah, I think there's exciting scholars who are doing that work, but as you say, beyond academia, perhaps there's even more exciting approaches. And I think art is really an incredible visceral space where we see this kind of work happening. Personally, I'm engaged in a project that's funded by the NEH in which we're looking at the mangrove as a model, so an ecology for thinking across Asian diaspora. And to your question about what cannot be read, I feel like the knottedness of the roots of the mangrove is actually exciting to think about what is not clear, what is knotted, what is not linear in a way. So I think that we need to be thinking of non-binary models that actually show us that there have always been these complex histories. Also within Asian diaspora, the banyan tree, I think is a common symbol. So I see a lot of digital humanities projects within Asian American studies and Pacific Islander studies that are really reaching for what connects us with maybe roots coming from the sky. And I find that exciting because of who the audience is. And it's about, yeah, I guess, not centering the legibility to an institution per se. Who do we want to be legible to? I'm always being told, you're illegible. Maybe I don't want to be legible.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, also one thing that I think really inspired me about the folks who joined the panel is just the kind of multimodal approaches, all the different disciplines that are brought to bear in the work that you produce. And and you know, I think there's also something you said for decentering the primacy of text as a medium for, as a source of knowledge, or as a medium for knowledge. And you know, one experience I've had is like, I'll watch, you know, I'll look at an old stereogram, or I'll watch a YouTube video or something, and so much of the information that is important to me about stories and histories, and also just that I'm relating to and picking up on, is not spoken or written in these. It's stuff in the background. And sometimes it's unintentionally in the background. It's caught in the background of a frame of a photo by someone who didn't know what they were looking at. But sometimes it's also present, but it's not being articulated verbally. Like I'm obsessed with woodworking joints from traditional Korean craft. And so I'll look at old photos and I'll look at the joints in the background of the picture, and I'll receive information from ancestral practices about those through that kind of, like you said, listening, but in different channels. So I appreciate the sort of various ways that you all have engaged in your different disciplines.
Jeffrey, can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Excuse me. Yeah, I think this is actually a good place for me to bring up the Smithsonian's cancellation of the Asian American Literary Festival, because I think it resonates in some ways along the same lines of not recognizing what is in their hands. There's a way that event acts as a community archive. There's a way that, in the same way that we were talking about tenderness in the last conversation, that when you see something that touches you, you remember that. And we have so few national platforms for Asian American literary expression that to cancel something at this level, even as it is a small event in the scale of the Smithsonian, is a big event for the Asian American community. And that, to me, demonstrates a lack of understanding what that is. And I think in the vein of unrecognized wealth or unrecognized connections, it's also important to point out that this panel has been described as Asian American and Pacific Islander, but we don't have a lot of Pacific Islander representation in this work, and often that gets left out of the conversations of AAPI. We just use that acronym without recognizing the PI part, which is a completely different pan-ethnicity. It's actually more connected to Native studies and Native communities because of histories of colonialism and imperialism. And so there's even ways that what is thought of as Asian American is something that still needs to be unpacked. So I think in that way that you're talking about seeing these details and being able to connect to those things, that I feel like are those opportunities that are held within the Asian American Literary Festival that provide opportunities for people to see those things and to connect on that level. So a real tragedy, that we won't have that festival this year. But I think feeling that loss is also, I think, that kind of connection to, realizing its value and needing to articulate how do we make it so that we don't have to rely on institutions for these kinds of recognition. That one of the things I've been working on is trying to provide pathways for a next generation of cultural workers, people that work in museums, people that work in these spaces, because we have to try to ask these questions in historically white institutions that then put us in a bind of how do we move that forward. So, it really is an intergenerational problem. an intergenerational kind of vision. So I think in that idea of misrecognition is a whole set of goals and other conversations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that we have to, if we want to know what censorship looks like in real time, we have to recognize what's happening in DC right now. We have to recognize what's happening with affirmative action. As much as we're gaining, so much is being lost, especially as we move towards 2024. So when we think about what we're seeing in the Colonial Archive, when we think about FOIA, when we think about what's redacted, what is actively happening, and how as a community, the Asian American Pacific Islander community, coming together to rally. We've seen letters coming together. It's an important moment, and answers need to be given. So it is great to be able to have this panel and like truly reflect on these colonial categories that put Asian American and Pacific Islander together. And it's just, yeah, an important time to really sit, again, with these cyclic questions, which are, what does this burden of representation mean? And who is actually present in the room and legible in different ways?
Yeah, thank you both. I have some other questions. I was thinking of also something that maybe that comes up in my work quite a bit, including at libraries, and that's the question of language barriers. It's something that I think is can be kind of fraught for diasporic community members, folks who have lost language or are in the process of relearning, such as myself. Yeah, I'm very curious about how language and language barriers and language access and language justice have played a role in your work or shaped it, or how perhaps that has changed in the past few years, as I do see some sort of shifting. Sure.
For me, this actually brings up a kind of resonant question about the barriers to collaborative work. Because the reality is that those of us who are a part of a diasporic community, whether it be an Asian diaspora or another diaspora, and it doesn't always have to be racially or ethnically defined, it could be a religious diaspora. The reality is that we don't have the kind of access that previous generations or, our ancestors may have had, and it is often seen as a source of like a lack. But I have found that as I make my way through, trying to be a professional historian, there are so many barriers to collaborative work. Like if I want to work with, why can't I work with someone? So I actually happen in my research, I do mostly Japanese and Korean history. And so I read those languages, and I was in a PhD program that trained me to read those languages. And actually I have probably the least experience among this group in English language archives. Actually, when I go into English language archives, I get so excited that everything is relatively more, just easier to read. I don't have to spend hours and hours and hours producing English translations. Because that's the thing, is that when there is a non-English language, a non-dominant language that you are trying to work through, it would be so helpful if you could work together with someone who either has that capacity and is interested, invested in the project. But at least in academia, the way it's set up is that for me to get tenure, I need to have a single authored publication, right? It can't be, I can't say that I did collaborative work and then have a publication be co-authored. And so there are systems in place that prevent collaborative work. That doesn't mean that we don't do it, because a lot of us care about that kind of work and want to do it. So I think the question of language is connected to kind of institutionalized ways of validating what counts as real research or not. Even in terms of, if you get translation assistance or whatnot, like, it's very different or rather, I know that the kind of external valuation of me saying, well, my mom helped me translate. My mom is like the best translator I have ever met. I mean, she can tell me the nuances of a particular Korean term that no academic working with Korean language materials has ever been able to do. Can I cite her? I mean, of course I acknowledge her, but like, can I cite her in my, right? Can I give her co-authorship? That, and again, that sort of connects to the first question about the personal as well, right? Like the personal within these sorts of systems becoming liabilities because I'm not gonna have job security if I'm citing my mom.
And I think, like, as much as we need new metadata, we do need new citational practices, because whose labor continues to get made invisible? It is the mothers or mother figures. And there is such a labor and nuance to translation that does get lost in terms of the national languages, which are recent constructs when we think about the nation state as a recent construct. So even if it comes down to learning Mandarin versus learning Cantonese, actually it's Hakka that I would need for my research. So that's why I feel like this sonic approach is an interesting one in terms of listening, because we lose so much in terms of the vernacular of the many different languages, like Telugu, right? If we're only looking at Hindi. So I find a lot of hope in the digital, since we're a DH panel, towards thinking about Asian, not as a race, but as a network, as a global network and a way of understanding infrastructure. So I run an organization called Afro-Asia Group, which started in 2019. And really we focus on Bandung and these different conferences that took place, right? So in 1955, the Asian African Conference. How is it that all of these different nations of the world who were decentering Europe in the 1950s, how did they speak to each other? And these are questions that I ask my students to answer with me, because there is a way for us to talk to each other in this act of ongoing decolonizing. And it doesn't require a European language, which has to be a colonial language in order to mediate. So part of how I do that, and it's experimental, is to think about what were people eating at Bandung? Why was Southeast Asia so important to this? What was the dance party like? What was the after party? And why don't we speculatively think about those questions, but also use the archive that exists of different people like Richard Wright, who noted what was happening? There actually is a blueprint that exists, and I think a way that we can read across languages and really respect the labor of translation.
Thank you, that's beautiful.
I think in terms of, like, translation is kind of personal for me, because I don't actually speak Telugu fluently, and I did when I was really little, but long story short, my teachers at school were like, told my parents that they had to speak English at home so I'd learn faster, and I lost Telugu, and I'm like also in the process of relearning. But yeah, I think translation has come up in my work because when I do oral history interviews with family, especially like extended families, like my grandmother didn't speak English, so we had that language barrier between us, and like our conversations were always like either both of us trying to patch together what each other was saying through like certain words that we recognized, or there had to be someone that was like an intermediary between us translating. And I realized, like, after doing oral history interviews with her and listening to it and kind of showing it to other family members, I was missing a lot, even with that translation there. So yeah, I think I think that language is like really important to me, and I would like to learn, if anyone knows where I can learn Telugu around here. And also kind of going back to the anecdote about that castle in Wales, it's called the Clive Collection, but I met a PhD researcher who was taking photographs and trying to translate the Persian that's inscribed on a lot of the objects, and it also was surprising to me that no one had translated it before. So I wonder how much visual material, or even like photographs that I've worked with a photo archive, and you can find like Tamil words in the background, and I wonder like there's so much information that people may be missing because of translation. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to also just lift up the work that that Tao is doing with the Afro-Asia group. Also, I hope some point on the panel you'll talk about dark laboratories. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah, you know, I really appreciate this question. It's something that I've really been thinking a lot about in the work that I'm doing in the state of Connecticut, where we're trying to reach, you know, new communities that haven't been asked these kinds of questions. And in particular, because I want to inform our state's API K through 8 model curriculum. And I want new communities to be included in that. And in that process, I came to think of access in a different way, and maybe it's more about capacity building, right? This idea that, well, you know, I've been really informed by Deepa Iyer's work. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but if you look up social change ecosystem, she has a wonderful way of thinking about social change and different leadership roles that people can take. One of the key leadership roles is storyteller. And a community that's seeking transformation needs a storyteller. And so this, to me, is an important part of building capacity and political agency for communities, that they're not just surviving or getting their story out there, but they're learning how to tell their own story, right, in their own words. And so in some ways I look at the translation issue as a kind of capacity issue, or how do we include people in what kind of trainings might be needed or support provided for different communities for their own purposes. And one example of that are, and I think to me this is maybe one of those areas that is kind of illegible in some ways, but that's like healing practices. And so like when I was listening to Winatu talk about the guild hall and in the medicine hall, how that was a particular kind of cultural practice, right? That, you know, we've seen this in South Asian communities with oral traditions for musical practice, like Carnatic and I can't remember how to pronounce the Gurbani Sangeet, the traditional Sikh music. And then also the gardening practices of Southeast Asian refugees, that is a form of cultural healing that that's embedded in their culture, and that doesn't produce necessarily that physical artifact that we would necessarily look at as, or a text that is, say, like, you know, something that could be archived, right? So, so again, oral traditions and stories, they sustain us. And for communities that, so like in Connecticut, it's, you know, the Asian American population has doubled since 2000. And the majority of that population is first generation. So this issue of translation and inclusion, and what are the things that they actually value, translation, you know, doesn't always fit squarely as a need for those different areas, right? But maybe more about capacity building.
Yeah, and just to follow up on what Yumi was saying about her mother, and I mean, I'm just thinking a lot about the limitations of scholarship. Like I grew up in Hong Kong. I speak Cantonese fine, and you know, there was this big name scholar trying to dissect this very well used phrase in Cantonese, but it's not something that you can easily look up in a dictionary, right? And he got it really wrong, right? He worked really hard on this, I'm sure, because the meaning of the phrase has nothing to do with the meaning of the individual words, right? So if you dissect the words, that's not what the phrase means. And you know, or just the speed at which change happens in language, right? So, you know, every time I go to Hong Kong, I just sound older and older because I'm not up with the new lingo, right? So I think, you know, there's some impossibility in terms of scholarship and translation, which I think we should simply recognize. I don't want to, because I'll give away who this person is if you know the scholarship, but we can talk later.
Well, thank you. I have actually many more questions, but I think we have to make also time for a questions Q&A session, if that's right, or how are we doing on time? I think that's a yes.
Thank you for a wonderful and thoughtful panel. I want to pick up on the questions that I'm hearing across a couple of panels, but also that Dr. Kim brought up and then other people brought up as well. And this kind of intervention about how we change culture so that we're not worried about, like, am I going to get tenure if I, right, like cite my mother or my grandmother or my uncle showed up, right? We finally got him interviewed, right? And the ways in which familial knowledge and oral knowledge and community knowledge, right, shows up in citational practices. So I got to be part of a group that wrote a guide called Writing About Slavery, Teaching About Slavery, This May Help. And it's a page and a half, and it got adopted in museums across Scotland and in high school classrooms all over. And I'm wondering, like, about a guide, right? I mean, we community sourced this in 2 or 3 weeks, right? And then it wasn't me making an argument or anybody else making an argument about the things that showed up as a citational practice. Capitalize Black, right? Don't argue with people, or, you know, when they use the word enslaver. This was 4 or 5 years ago, right? We've won that argument now, right? So, is there? Maybe this has already been done in this community, but is there a way to create collective guides that center the expertise of communities in citational practices that can then be circulated, that is short, right, and that is legible to multiple communities, right, that we can show our grandmother, right? When our grandmother says, I'm not an expert, you can be like, well, look at this one pager, right? You know, right? But that can also can change culture multi-generationally, can build capacity, right? What is the role of the extra scholar, because I remember thinking, right, I should be writing this article, this isn't going to count for anything, and it hasn't, right? But it's done more work across culture than anything else I've done besides one other thing, right? So, so how do we work collectively to change culture, to create practices that then can be affirmed in ways that create expertise just by making them public, right? And build expertise out of our own communities, I think is my question.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that very generative question. I'll just say a few things that come to mind, not necessarily solutions, but thoughts that arose while I was listening to the question. The first thing I think, actually, before we step into the collective, is that I know that for myself, something had to happen at a very deep individual level, which is that I had to really decolonize or begin to decolonize the way that I approached my work and my research and my scholarship. And that kind of deconditioning is not easy. As those of you who may be in or have been in a PhD program, those are spaces that can be quite dehumanizing, and they are spaces that make you think that only certain things will make you feel fulfilled and enable you to do the kind of work that you want to do. And I think based on conversations that we've already had today, I think that many of, at least the students I heard from, you all are way beyond where I was in that particular moment. But I first had to come to a place where I really could articulate for myself what mattered to me. And that has been probably the sort of biggest source of just a sense of like feeling liberated from the values that I had inherited. And so but I remain sensitive to those who are trying to work within these systems of accreditation and expertise granting sort of systems. But I do think that for me at least, it started kind of at a sort of individual level. In terms of the collective, one thing that comes to mind though, and this raises a bigger issue that we have already touched upon slightly in talking about the kind of elision of Pacific Islander when we talk about API and the way in which API itself, as Tal was saying, is a colonial category. It's not one that was generated from within, say, Asian American or Asian diasporic communities coming together with Pacific Islander communities. It didn't come from that. I'm not sure what collective means in a context of Asian American, if we're gonna use the category that we have here, API or even Asian American, I'm not quite sure to what level, like how finely would we need to differentiate so that we capture just like really even, you can just parse it at such a, where does one community begin and end? It's just so difficult to say, and even just within, often in conversations about Asian American and what Asian American as a category will often erase, which is more so, which is usually the case that it's Southeast Asians within the group that become marginalized, and East Asians kind of become the the poster children. But even within East Asian communities, there are deep colonial histories within Asian communities because of Japanese colonialism. So like, for instance, I'm not sure, I think a lot of Korean descended peoples would be very offended if I produced a document that was about, and I wouldn't, yeah. But I'm just sort of thinking through, like, yeah, because it's a really, it's a really interesting idea, and I think it would have to be sensitive, I think, to the kinds of sort of inter-Asian conflicts and tensions and histories of real violence and pain that still shape the way the communities don't come together. And in some ways I have found, and especially in the US, there's a way in which Asian Americans are kind of expected to come together. And I think it's really okay to look Asian American in whatever that means. So, but I'm really just thinking about myself here. Like, I've never thought of myself as Asian American. I don't feel American in any way. I was born and raised in LA, but I just don't identify, but like here I am on this panel. And so I'm thinking through those sorts of things as I think about, so what particular collective could a document like that address so that it doesn't, I guess it remains sort of sensitive and true to the really complicated histories of the people we're trying to bring together into collectivity.
I love that because, right, any diaspora is about a heterogeneity, right? It's never, right, the collectivity never means homogeneous. And so something you might, begin with is this community is a heterogeneous community with multiple colonial histories, conflicts, right? Partnerships, right, allyships, etc., and that needs to be recognized in any work that is done. And that's one of the principles that might be on such a, to articulate exactly what it is that you just said. This is not a homogeneous community. Its complexities, its different histories always need to be recognized in the work that is being done, right? How do we start to advance some of the stuff we have to brush, we always have to articulate to people, right? Even to get to what it is that you're suggesting.
And that's what I think some of the work that can be done through these guides if we choose to use them.
I guess I could chime in to respond as well, because I think these are important questions that are unanswered. It's not just us reciting the same kind of conversations, and I love that you were really thinking through it as you were talking, because I agree, the question of the collective is a fraught one, right? It's a vexed one. And there's a scholar who I've been working with, Joan Key, who just published a book on the geometries of Afroasia. And I think we both have this discomfort with the word solidarity. And her reason for that, and I think mine as well, is because there could be a kind of way in which the fixation becomes on solidarity instead of like, what was the solidarity for? So I think it would require all of us interrogating what the solidarity is for, not just interracial coalition, but for what? Is it for liberation? What does that horizon look like? And I think it would require us looking at Asian studies as a colonial field and really thinking about its methodologies and how we could dismantle that. So within my own work and my training within American studies, I think we can look to ethnic studies and our different interdisciplinary training. But for me, a lot of this becomes rooted in Black studies and its methodologies, which are irreverent by nature. So I guess some examples that I can give of what I have done as an attempt and as a pre-tenure individual is to really push when it comes to copy editing for peer-reviewed articles. So I have tried to see what I can get away with, and it's worked in the sense that I wrote a digital humanities article about mapping technologies. And instead of having it be listed as acknowledgements, I changed it to the map key. And then I listed all of my students and talked about how the map is not possible without the key and who it takes. So all the technologists, all the librarians, all the archivists, there was like 50 of us who worked on the project. Why should it just be my name on it? When I do work in sound studies, I've been able to push and change the acknowledgements to the liner notes. So I feel like there are ways in which we should think about the genres of acknowledgement and citation and actually see what makes sense to us. We don't just have to sit with that one peer-reviewed way of doing things. I've also managed to co-author with my students with virtual reality projects that we have created. So in one article, 13 of us published together, and it was exciting to kind of share the byline with them, but it's about taking a risk. In another world-building project, 33 of us were co-authors, but it takes journals like Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures in the Americas that are peer-reviewed in order to give us the credit to be able to do this work. So we will see what happens. It's about taking a risk, but I have hope. But it's definitely not easy to try to push against these structures and how to give credit.
Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to add another piece to the conversation because this is kind of, in some ways, a reflection of the challenge of trying to build an API K-8 curriculum. How do we kind of create that kind of summative document that connects and builds competency and confidence in teaching this material? And one of the ways I've been talking about this is to use the language of historians, that we say that every generation writes their own history because the past is relevant in new ways, and each generation brings new values to interpreting evidence of the past. And so I think in some ways, every generation rewrites what it means to be Asian American, and that's going to look differently. So I love the provocation, Tao, that you're saying, because the model of the 60s and 70s as Asian American is completely illegible to the youth today, and their definitions are just as vibrant, just as valuable, and with way different vocabularies and connections, geopolitics, wrestling with caste and sexuality, and gender diversity. So the ways that we can provide the platform for people to have that conversation, that's, I think, where, you know, like how we define is by creating the platforms for people to have the conversation. Typically, it happens when there's a crisis. After the spa shootings in Atlanta, right? That was a moment where we had to say who we were and explore our connections to each other. But it doesn't always have to happen in crisis. Crisis is a punctuated moment in which that happens. But what if that could happen through strength, through love, through tenderness, what we were talking about before? You know, I think that's the aim, I think, for this kind of, you know, summative place that we want to build, not to be definitive, but to be exploratory.
Thank you so much. How are we doing on time? I think we were reaching. Yeah. Did you want to say one more thing?
I don't want to put Eric on the spot, but I feel like you said something during our initial Zoom call that feels relevant about like thinking about like on a smaller scale, like localities and the different kind of, yeah, how Asian American gets defined within like local communities versus like as a nation. So.
Yeah, so one of the things we talked about, you know, was what might the Library of Congress can do. And one of the things I mentioned, now that I live a little bit in this city, or right outside the city, is that if you study especially the early history of Asian communities in Washington, D.C., it is unlike any other Asian community in the country. It is a much more wealthy community, and it's a much more educated community because a lot of them are government workers or diplomats. Lawyers who work with these people. There are also others, a lot of Filipinos, when it was a US colony, a lot of Filipinos were brought over to be bodyguards or service people for government workers, right? I think the Library of Congress can do a lot of good by focusing Asian American collecting on local communities rather than national communities.
And I feel like, Jeffrey, you've done so much exciting work on this, so I'm just glad you're moderating this conversation. But yeah, the local feels really important. And I also just want to give a shout out to that. We're part of a collective called Asianish, which really is blurring and questioning, you know, the definitions of these terms. So I think Jason put it really well, that there's just so many multiple definitions that are constantly being redefined.
Yeah, thank you all. One more?
Yeah, thank you. Hi. I have a comment first and then a question, and I'll try to make it briefer than I originally intended. My first comment is thank you for this panel. As a first-generation Filipino American, I often feel like I don't fit into the Asian American and Pacific Islander diaspora. Am I Asian American? Am I Pacific Islander? Where do I fall in between? And I don't identify with that community, and I feel validated in my feelings now, and that I don't have to make a choice to stick myself in there and identify as a Filipino woman. I hope that makes sense. My question is, and I hope my boss is not still on the call because this is a little bit critical of my institution. So I'm here as an individual, but I also come representing the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which is a special collections library and archive. And we, in the early 2000s, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania absorbed the Balch Institute for Ethnic Studies. So we have a really actually robust collection related to Asian American communities in the Mid-Atlantic, not just in Pennsylvania. But the way that some of those collections are treated, not that they're mistreated, it's just that I feel like sometimes they can be misrepresented or misinterpreted to the public, especially related to sensitive materials. So I can think of one example of these sketches and drawings from a woman named Sumiko Kobayashi, who she and her family were incarcerated in Topaz, Utah. And she was a teenager, and she's still alive. She's well into her 90s now, but those drawings are held at our institution, and I often feel like they're toted out for this amazing example of a treasure that we have in our collection rather than an example of some very sensitive topic and material related to Asian American history, and something that we're still reckoning with in American history. And so what I would ask of this panel is what institution or advice could you offer institutions when dealing with these types of collections, and how we're sharing them among scholars who might be using them for research, and how we're interpreting them to the public? That was a lot, sorry.
I mean, maybe I can respond a little bit from my own work in Providence's Chinatown. And I'm thinking a lot of some comments from earlier, but when I think about this, but you know, I mentioned this phenomenon of sort of looking in the background for details and finding things and receiving information that has not been received for a very long time, or you know, was not understood or something. There's another channel that happens in community archives and family archives, and I think it's interesting because I very rarely explicitly use materials from community or family archives directly in my work. They are the most personal. They're in some sense kind of the richest kinds of materials, but they're also, I think, least appropriate for a public work. And so they're there, like they're present, but they're not visible. You know what I mean? Like I'm learning from them, I'm listening, and I'm understanding things, and I'm trying to take some of those learnings into the work that I produce. But you won't see them like within the virtual space that I create or something. You won't see them directly. You might see like a sense, or you might see a texture or a feeling or something, a presence. That's the hard part about being an artist, is trying to not translate, but to honor something in there's a non-linearity to it. You're not just mapping this thing that you saw, extracting it and placing it within the scene or something. So I think that's a process that is challenging, but it's something that's definitely a part of my work.
I mean, I have two quick responses. One is that, do you know what she wants? The other quick response is the community is not monolithic. They're not going to agree with each other about how to treat that. So I think it's important to make explicit decisions, ethical decisions, and just explain it and try to be transparent about it. And I think transparency is all you can do, because there is not a good answer to the question.
Yeah, and I think if that exists for this set of documents, it probably exists for many other pieces in the collection. You know, it also occurred to me that, you know, as you're talking, I was thinking, well, there are other categories by which it could be, you know, shared with the public. If it's, maybe it's a part of a collection that's art from incarcerated peoples, right? Or it's, or maybe exploring, you know, art and healing, or, you know, that it's not just a kind of singularity, but it's connected in a way that makes the history relevant. Yeah.
I guess, I mean, to address the particular question, collection that you brought up, and I don't know, I was having a conversation with someone else before about how it's amazing that even though I'm trained to be a historian, I've had so little exposure to what it actually takes to be an archivist, even though I am like a, you know, consumer of archival materials. You know, I'm sure you have already like systems in place in which you can consult with either individual scholars or groups that would have the expertise to be able to properly contextualize the kinds of drawings that you mentioned. So my first thought was actually, there's this whole, so Japanese internment is probably one of the better known sort of pieces of Asian American history. What is not really known and not really talked about in terms of Japanese internment is the fact that people who immigrated from Japan had histories before they entered this country, and those histories also affected the ways in which they experienced internment. There's that piece. But there's also very little on the kinds of relocation that happens from camps to places like Philadelphia's suburbs, to Baltimore, to, I mean, we're talking like the boonies, like places where you would, it's like, why is there Japanese produce coming from Eastern Maryland? It's because people were relocated, and it's usually, they started with the teenagers. So it's usually teenagers who are first relocated without their parents, if they were lucky with their sibling, but usually not. And they're basically just, the War Relocation Authority picks a random place where they think that Japanese people cannot come together as a kind of collective enemy. So my first thought was, I'd want to find someone who knows and who can contextualize what that relocation process was like, and who would have at least sort of the knowledge to be able to contextualize the drawings in that way, in addition to, of course, consulting with the person. I mean, if she, as you say, if she's alive. But then there are also organizations that have done really deep research and thinking and archival work, like densho.org. You could go to densho.org, that is specifically focused on Japanese American internment related materials. And they have guidelines. I mean, like, speaking of guidelines, like, they have guidelines, they have people you can consult. So I imagine this is already a part of your practice, but it would just require the work of tracking down the individuals and institutions who could give you some feedback and context.
And I'll just add quickly, I think that there's a lot of expertise, especially in Black feminism and women of color feminism, about strategies. And I feel like we've all been talking about strategies for how to do this work ethically. So of course, Saidiya Hartman talks about how can we basically, I guess, replicate the grammar without repeating the violence. And I think you have to sit with the question of, am I repeating the violence? Do I have to? And I think that is a very ethical question that one has to sit with. In terms of that grammar, even, I mean, I've had to learn as a professor of Asian American studies that, you know, people decide how they want to be called. So in terms of internment, Japanese American internment, like the American there may be significant to some communities because that was such a fraught category. Even though I may disavow my American identity, as I think Yumi did, it's like just trying to understand what it meant to that person and why maybe being called Japanese would be different for them than being called Japanese American. So again, to what Eric said, being able to talk to that person she's living makes a big difference.
I'll also just, sorry, we're out of time. I'll also just quickly add, thinking about this in digital space too, like when things get digitized, I feel like too often metadata and cataloging information is like just as lacking as in the physical archive. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you, everybody. I guess maybe that wraps up. Yeah. So I just want to reiterate thanks to all the panelists for joining and for sharing, you know, and to CCDI for having us. All right.
Thank you.
Afternoon. I just want to thank again our new awardees, Maya Cade and Andre Brock, for their amazing conversation. Sorry, sir. And also to the DH panelists. And I didn't get to ask any questions, but I'm really hoping that later on the day and tomorrow and beyond, that conversation was just so incredible in so many ways. And I'm also interested in the connections in terms of Black studies and Asian Studies, Asian American Studies as well. Just want to thank you again if you all are still with us from the live stream. We invite you to continue to connect with CCDI, and I just want to say really quickly that you can do so in 3 ways. The first is subscribe to the Of the People blog. You can just do a browser search for Library of Congress, Of the People, and blog. That's a great way to keep up with what CCDI is doing. The second thing is also to check out CCDI's web pages on the Of the People website at loc.gov/CCDI. And finally, if you were inspired by the awardees, by our current scholar in residence, and you're thinking, hey, that's something I might want to do, we do have 2 open calls right now. We're accepting proposals for the Artist or Scholar in Residence Award. That's due on the 7th of August. And we're also accepting proposals for the Higher Education in Libraries, Archives, Museums Awards, and those are due on the 7th of September. So information about all 3 of those awards are on, again, the Of the People blog and also on the Of the People website. So again, thank you everyone who's here in person. Thank you for those who joined us via live stream. And this recording will be available probably within the next month or so. And thank you again, and just keep on checking us out, and we're going to keep on doing exciting things and bringing together wonderful people like we did today. So thank you again. Take care.